right.
Thank you, Evie.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Just giving it a minute for everybody to come through the waiting room.
5 of the nation's biggest corporations paid zero.
And after this great introduction, let's get started. It is with great pleasure that I welcome everyone to the Harry Darbagosian Fellowship Symposium, titled Cultivated Imaginaries, Superblock and the Idea of the City, and organized by Liang Wang and moderated by Liang Wang and Dean Speaks, alongside, of course, a series of extraordinary guests. Welcome, everyone. I want to start us off with a few housekeeping remarks. First, if you would like to enable closed captioning, you can find instructions in the chat. Please try to make sure you keep your microphones muted during the event, and you're always welcome and encouraged to keep your cameras on. After each panel of guests completes their presentations, there will be roundtables open for Q&A. And I wanted to encourage everyone to type questions in the chat, and the moderators will ask them on your behalf. Finally, the event will run for approximately 3 hours, and everybody will do their best to be respectful of everyone's time and stay on schedule. I wanted to let you know there won't be a formal break, so we're testing everyone's stamina today, but please plan to take individual breaks. All right, off to the exciting part. I'd like to introduce the mastermind of today's event before giving him this virtual floor. Liang Wang is a 2020-2021 Harry Darbagosian Fellow at the School of Architecture at Syracuse. His fellowship project, titled The Architecture of the Commons, engages the idea of commons in relation to the disciplinary knowledge of architecture, and particularly through the lens of the superblock. His research looks into the role of architecture as both common means for spatial production and common knowledge in conceiving new modes of collective life and the idea of the city. Prior to joining us here at Syracuse, Liang was a teaching fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he was also, has been actually pursuing his doctorate degree since 2017. He's co-author of the book Urban Blocks and the Grids, History, Technical Features and Outcomes, and co-editor of the forthcoming issue Commons of the New Geographist Journal. His scholarship has been recognized by the Peter G. Rose Scholarship of Harvard University and supported by multiple departments at Harvard in the School of Design and beyond. Liang holds a Master of Architecture in Urban Design with distinction from the GSD, where he was also awarded the Urban Design Thesis Prize and the Clifford Wong Prize in Housing Design. He also holds a Master of Architecture from Rice, where he won the Morris Pittman Award in Architecture and the Fondren Research Award. And lastly, a Bachelor of Architecture from the Harbin Institute of Technology in China, where he was the recipient of the National Scholarship by the Ministry of Education of China. In other words, Liang has never left an institution without garnering every award possible. Really impressive, Liang. Last, and in addition to his academic work, Liang has worked internationally in a series of exciting practices: Herzog Demeron in Basel, SOM in New York, Bjarke Ingels Group in Copenhagen, WW Architecture in Houston, and Atelier Liu Yuyang in Shanghai. After this experience, he co-founded his Boston and Shanghai-based practice Commons Office. Please join me in welcoming Liang. Congratulations, Liang, for today's event, and thank you, Dean Speaks and all the speakers for joining us today.
Wow, thank you, Evie, for that super kind introduction. And of course, thank you for all your help and kindness in assisting us with all logistics for this event. Really, really appreciate it. And hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Liang, and I would like to begin by welcoming all of you to this year's Harry Darbagosian Fellowship Symposium. This is a special event organized both as the concluding event for our school's spring public programs, as well as the culminating event for my fellowship this year. It's been an absolute privilege for me to be able to work on and take on this fellowship over this year, and to be able to organize together with our Dean Speaks in the past months for this symposium. And we're also truly honored to be able to have 4 distinguished guests today with us: Professor Yves Blau, Professor Peter Carl, Professor Nancy Steinhardt, and Professor Jianfei Zhu, a truly stellar group of scholars and thinkers. So I'm very much looking forward to our conversation today with all of you. Before I present you our dean for his opening remarks and introduce our guest today, I would like to take maybe a very brief moment to make a few acknowledgements for my fellowship this year. First, I'd like to say that this event is made possible by the Henry de Boghossian Fellowship Programs, as you already know, here at our school. And none of these would have been possible for the past year without the strong support from our architecture school and Syracuse University. And of course, it goes without saying that I would like to acknowledge my deep gratitude to our own and beloved Dean Michael Speaks for his unwavering support and generosity in sharing his advice and wisdom throughout my teaching fellowship this past year. Now that this event basically marks the end of my teaching programs for this academic year, I guess I could say that being, this year's fellow and also being part of this great faculty members at the Syracuse community, it's absolutely the best thing happened to me in 2020. That's I can say for sure. So thank you, Michael, for everything. In addition, I'd also like to thank our Associate Dean Julia Cerniak for her support and kind advice for both my seminar and VC studio teaching this year. It's certainly been a great pleasure for me to get to know Julia and also to be able to work with her and learn from her expertise in terms of pedagogy and also her expertise in landscape architecture and urbanism. Of course, I wouldn't be here at all without the fundamental support and advisorship from my doctoral advisors at Harvard University, Professor Peter Rowe and Professor Yves Blau, who is actually here with us. And I'm immensely grateful for their mentorship in shaping my own research and research thinking and framework, and also providing all the guidance for my academic endeavors in the past years. I'm really grateful. And also throughout my fellowship this year, I've had the great pleasure to be able to meet many very supportive generals and also talented, amazing faculty members and staff here at our school. They have helped me in different ways in shaping and adapting my own teaching ideas, frameworks, and methods and forms into the larger framework of the school and community. So for that, I'd like to thank Professor Fei Wang, Susan Henderson, Mark Linder, Kyle Miller, of course, Evie Diamantopoulou, I hope that I pronounced it right, Bing Bu, Abingo Wu, Francisco Fannin, and Professor Lawrence Chua, Debbie Chen, and our previous fellow, James Lun. And of course, along with Andy, Tug, Elizabeth, and Deborah for their essential logistical support over this year. Thank you all very much. And also my deep gratitude goes to all my students for the past year for indulging me to experiment with my own teaching ideas and framework. And it's really been a pleasure for me to be able to work with this very, very talented and hardworking students here at Syracuse. I think many of them are here today with us. So thank you guys and welcome. Last, but certainly not least, I also wanted to thank my lovely wife, Lu. I think she's somewhere here in the audience. Of course, I'm fundamentally in debt for her unconditional love and support and all the encouragement, and especially for her very high standard for my cooking skills. I promised her over the semester that I would improve my cooking skills and make her something super delicious for dinner. So far, I haven't succeeded yet by her standard, but I will try. I'm hopeful that after today's event, with all the inspirations from you, that I can be one step closer to that success. So I know she's smiling. With that, I guess now it's my great honor and pleasure to present you our very own and beloved Dean Michael Speaks. Michael, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Liang. Great to be here. Great. Let me join Liang in welcoming everyone here today. It's terrific to see everybody here. We do have a stellar group of speakers today, and I'm really excited to hear them present and to learn from their presentations and discussion. I want to say just a couple of things. Professor Liang is the 5th Boghossian Fellow, and the fellows, as you may or may not know, join us each year for 9 months. Essentially, they join in August and they conclude their work at the end of the 2nd semester, and they typically teach a studio and 2 seminars, all these courses are meant to support and enrich their research agenda, which they determine before they arrive. And Leon has done really a wonderful job this year. It's been my great pleasure to work with him and to learn from his work and to watch him develop it and to follow his courses. I also want to say that, and we typically do this each year at our when we hold our symposium. Well, let's say so the fellow typically has that teaching assignment. They also very often will do an exhibition. This year that was difficult, although it appears, I think is very likely Leon will do an exhibition in the fall. So his exhibition will be delayed to the fall. So he will do an exhibition, a physical installation. And then typically the fellow does a public presentation or a symposium. And that has occurred in every year except for last year. And at that symposium, we typically announce the fellow for the next year. And it's my great pleasure today to announce our fellow for 2021 as Lean Katrib. Lean is here today. I don't know, Lean, could you wave at us so we know who you? Lean is here today. She did a Bachelor of Architecture at USC and a master's at Princeton, and she is going to be. Her research project is very exciting, and I'm going to keep that somewhat a secret because there's a piece appearing in the paper probably in a couple of hours. Maybe it's already there that will describe that and other things. But I just wanted to welcome her today and welcome her to the school and to welcome her to the fellowship. And we look forward to working with her this next year. So with that, I'm going to end and say I look forward to all of this. These presentations. And let me make one more very, very quick comment. Please indulge me, sorry, about the format. We debated, Liang and I did for a while about whether or not to do 2 sessions and do a break in between. But it's on Zoom, breaks don't really mean anything. It's just a kind of a gap in time. Because if you want to grab another coffee or a Manhattan or whatever you might be interested in doing, you can always just put up your avatar and go and do it. So we thought in the interest of flow and continuity and to maintain the conversation that we would go straight through. So please feel free to pop in and out as you like. We will be here the whole time. We green backgrounders. And I would also say, if you don't have one, you should go to our website if you like and grab one of these and put it up behind you. In any case, I'm going to stop there. I'm probably already over time. I always am over time, but I look forward to the events, and I'm going to give it back to Liang, who's going to give a kind of a framing of the larger conversation, and essentially. This is a framing of of a large part of his research project, and these 4 presentations are, in some ways, responses not partly to that, but they're elaborations of a great deal of very powerful and longstanding research. So I'm going to give it over to you, Liang, and take.
Great. Thank you, Michael, for that wonderful opening remarks. And I think we're good on time. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I'd like to, as Michael suggested, to briefly frame the theme of our symposium today. and then of course to introduce our distinguished guests today. Maybe I will start by very briefly elaborating why we're interested in and investigating the superblock as a topic, as a subject, and also providing maybe some background information about the framing and hypothesis for our discussion today. As many of you know, my fellowship research this year at Syracuse really has evolved around this very topic of the superblock, which is a term that almost all architects, planners, and policymakers are familiar with. Used to describe the building blocks of large-scale urban projects ranging from Raymond Aun's town extension plan to the housing blocks in the New Frankfurt and Red Vienna, to the mid-20th century Soviet microrayon, and to the multiplicity of the mega developments that sprung up all over China since the 1980s. Superblock is a term that is conversant, useful, and wonderfully imprecise. Indeed, despite its widespread use, there is so far no clear established definition of the term. Alan Cahone's 1971 essay, The Superblock, arguably still remains to this day the only piece that dissects this subject in both theoretical and historical terms. The invasive nature of the concept of the superblock, spatially, socially, and culturally, coupled with the lack of theoretical framing of its discursive knowledge, really constituted the very first and initial driving force for our collective research here. The other important aspect of the superblock discourse, perhaps the most evident one, is the reality of the built environment that the superblock really entailed across different cultural and geographic contexts, meaning its urban form, community formation, and everyday practices. From the aspiration for the solar equity in the early implementation of the superblock development in the 1920s and 30s Europe, to the idea of constructing the socialist city later in the Soviet Union territory, and that in some of the modernizing countries in South America in the 70s and 80s, and eventually to the vast and drastic modernization process in East Asian countries, which is perhaps best exemplified in the post-1980s China. Superblock perhaps manifests its best in practices, projects, and their associate operations. In other words, the planning of the city, the constructing of community, as well as the building of architecture and urban spaces. The reality of the superblock in many ways entails a set of specificities and conditions and transitions that are pertaining to certain underpinning cultural and social specificities and logic. So the search for a more nuanced reading of the social and cultural conditions in the reality of the superblock, as well as the pursuit for the underlying logic in the formation of such conditions, really formulate the second layer of our research endeavor. And additionally, the superblock discourse for me has always manifested at the intersecting territory and space between the disciplinary knowledge of architecture and urbanism. As architects and urbanists, to inquiry and examine this subject is to define a position on the city and its architecture, and to claim the political, social, and cultural relevance of spatial production in searching for the idea of the city today. Alan Cahone suggested that the superblock not only describes an urban typology, but also as a concept, it gives architects or designers in general the kind of license to creatively imagine the totality of the city, an authority that was relinquished with the mass industrialization and the emergence of ever more sophisticated, abstract, and cybernetic forms of capitalistic development. As the processes described by Cahone in the 1971 essay have quickened, intensified, and become ever more pervasive, the city in turn has become ever more complex, abstract, and virtual. Therefore, the creative speculation of the kind described by Cahone has now become even more important as us designers and policymakers attempt to imagine a more equitable, sustainable, and humane future city. In light of these background and considerations, this symposium is really an attempt to bring together a group of experts on this topic and examine collectively the discourse of superblock, meaning its concept, reality, and imaginary, as well as the idea of the city in both the context of the West and in China. We propose to do so by addressing three interlinked issues: one representational, one praxis-oriented, and one epistemological. Accordingly, we propose three working hypotheses for today's discussion. First, the representational agency of the superblock today lies in the kind of speculative possibilities of the so-called superblock imaginary, a scale of urban representation and abstract that might help us to better picture, analyze, and understand the city as a collective act and a collective form, instead of that of a singularity. Secondly, the specificities and conditions of their underpinning logic of the superblock might allow us to right-size the scale of the development and focus more on the middle scale commons in between the entire city planning and individuals' quotidian lives, one perhaps better suited to address the many hidden structural inequities revealed in the past year by the global pandemic. And lastly, with a deep dive into some of the historical episodes of the superblock and its nuanced cultural, social, and political ratings, especially that between the West and the Chinese urbanizations, we might begin to reposition and reconsider the notion of modernism and modernization from one that is rather linear and singular to one that is more spontaneous and multiple. With these hypotheses in mind, as Michael mentioned just now, we organized today's event as a roundtable discussion. Our four guests are grouped into two panels. One focuses more on the Western perspective and context, and the other focuses more from its Chinese counterpart, to make it a little bit simpler in terms of the formatting of the panels today. And in responding to the thematic framing of the symposium, in the first panel, we will have Professor Yves Blau and Professor Peter Carl. Each of them will give us a 15 minutes presentation, which will be followed by 40 minutes open discussion joined by all four panelists. In a similar fashion, in the second panel, we'll be having Professor Nancy Steinhardt and Professor Jianfei Zhu. Their presentation will also be followed by a 40 minutes open discussion with everyone. Now with the framing and the organization of the symposium out of the way, finally now it's my great honor to introduce our distinguished guests today. Yves Blau is an adjunct professor of the history and theory of urban form at Harvard University Graduate School of Design, where she is the director of research and co-director of the Harvard Mellon Urban Initiative. She will be presenting her talk today on the superblock and the production of socialist space. On a personal note, as you already know by now, Yves is my doctoral advisor at Harvard, and her research on the idea of superblock and urban form has been fundamentally important and really shaped my research thinking in a fundamental way. And also, I have to say, it's both a great honor and pleasure, and also really intimidating to be sitting in the same panel with your own advisors. So please forgive me if I say anything wrong today. Peter Carl, he has taught graduate design and history and philosophy of architecture at the University of Cambridge for almost 3 decades. He also established the PhD program in architecture at London Metropolitan University. Peter has taught at both University of Kentucky and also the Harvard GSD. Peter will share with us today his perspective on the superblocks through his definition of the urban depths. And again, on a personal note, I got to know Peter when he was actually teaching at the GSD, where I conducted a very informal interview with him on the subject of Roma inter rota, which maybe some of you know. Peter was working with Colin Rowe for their very important historic exhibition project then. Ever since, I became very fascinated by Peter's scholarship at the intersection between the theoretical framework of architecture and also the practice knowledge of the city today. So it's wonderful to have you, Peter, and welcome. Nancy Steinhardt is professor of East Asian art and curator of Chinese art at the University of Pennsylvania. Nancy is one of the earliest academic figures in the US to introduce a history of Chinese architecture and urban planning to its Western audiences. Many of her books and publications on Chinese architecture and urban history remain very seminal in the field. In today's talk, Nancy will examine the superblock ideology, primarily in the pre-modern era in the Chinese city. I had the great pleasure to read several of Nancy's books and have been really admiring her knowledge and scholarship on the Chinese architecture and urban history for a very long time. So it's great to finally be able to see you, Nancy, and it's a great honor to have you here, and welcome. Jianfei Zhu is a professor of East Asian architect at Newcastle University in UK. He had taught in China and Australia before joining Newcastle in 2019. Jianfei's research has centered on relations between power, culture, and architecture. And today he will be speculating on constructing a new kind of imaginary of the big data based on the relationship between scale and the superblock. I have to say, Jianfei is also someone that I feel like I have known for a long time from his scholarship and writings, although I haven't really met him personally before. And I know Jianfei has a lot to share today, so I'm very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this very topic. So again, I guess, welcome to all of our guests today. And I'm very confident and convinced that we will be having a very stimulating and constructive conversation today. I guess without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Eve Blau to give her presentation first, and then followed by Professor Peter Carl. And the screen is yours now, Eve.
Great, thank you very much, Liang. I think probably before I say anything, I should figure out how to share my screen here. So here we go.
Yes.
And
good.
I think we're all set. Is that right? Can everybody see it? Fantastic. Thank you very much, Liang, and thank you also, Michael, for the invitation and the kind introductions. And it's a great pleasure. I was going to say it's a great pleasure to be here, but we're all in different places. So it's a great pleasure to be a part of this event and to be sharing this event with you, and to be talking about Superblock, because Liang and I have been thinking and talking about Superblock together for a very long time. And this is a sort of nice way to carry that conversation forward with some new and exciting, for me, new and exciting interlocutors whose work I know, but who I've not met before now. So the focus of my talk is a concept of superblock that emerged in Britain in the early 1900s, and then moved steadily eastward to Germany in the 1920s, and from there to Soviet Russia in the 1930s, and then across the USSR and its satellites, where it became a core component of mid-20th century Soviet planning, and also a key determinant of the scale and organization and socio-spatial character of socialist urban space from the late 1950s to the late 1980s. So my purpose in tracing this trajectory is both to show the evolution of an operative concept of superblock that sought to create a new kind of more equitable social space in the modern city, and ascribed an active role to architecture in shaping it, and also to suggest, just a little bit at the end here, its renewed interest for our thinking about the city today, this particular concept of superblock. So this concept, as I will argue, entered socialist urban planning and design indirectly through one of the most important urban architectural innovations, architectural innovations and planning innovations in early 20th century planning. And that was Raymond Unwin's superblock, a cornerstone of his planning and theory, planning theory and practice, which focused, as you no doubt know, on the Garden City and the Garden Suburb and planning of them, including Letchworth Garden City, which you see here on the screen, aerial view and a plan. Now, one of Unwin's major concerns in his Garden City design was with solar orientation and the insolation of buildings. And it was those concerns, interestingly, that led him to the concept of superblock. Now, Unwin dealt with solar orientation at length in his book, which was Town Planning and Practice of 1909. And here are two examples from the book of solar diagrams. On the left is an analysis of sunrise and sunset in London compared to other cities. And on the right is an analysis of the relative elevation and path of sun at different times of the year in London. And so insolation, not insulation, but insolation was a major concern of Unwin's. And for Unwin, solar orientation was not just an ecological and a public health consideration in housing design. It was not just about bringing daylight into living space. It was a very important economic and social principle for him. In fact, an ethical question of social equity. And this underlies this concept of superblock that I'm going to talk about and that I'm interested in here. So the problem that Unwin struggled with in both his practice and in his theoretical writing was how to integrate solar orientation into urban planning. In other words, into the capitalist space of the modern metropolis. And the main culprit, according to Unwin, and in his view, and in the British context, was the so-called bylaw street in England. And this was actually the result of an important piece of public health legislation, which was the Public Health Act of 1875, which was designed to get rid of the hidden slum, as it was called, that dense building in the center of the block. And I show you an example of that in the upper left-hand corner, which was described by Friedrich Engels in Manchester and in London in the 1840s. So for Unwin, though, the tightly packed rows of back-to-back houses, and you can see them in an aerial view here and in a schematic drawing on the left, these back-to-back houses created by the bylaw street constituted another kind of slum that deprived their inhabitants of sunlight and open space and greenery. And the solution, as Unwin saw it, was a new form and scale of urban block, essentially a superblock, and he actually called it that. And Unwin's famous diagram here of superblock, which was titled "Nothing Gained by Overcrowding," made an argument for the economic advantages of superblock as a planning concept. And this was the way in which he was hoping to actually make it possible that this would be accepted as a planning strategy. Now, his argument, as you can see here in this diagram, was that superblock allowed for major savings on infrastructure construction costs because it made it necessary to build fewer streets. And so this meant that one could build at lower density inside the block, as well as increase open space and greenery and sunlight, since the higher land costs of lower density were offset by savings on street construction costs. Hence, nothing gained by overcrowding. And in his practice, Unwin began experimenting with ways of freeing the building line from the street line, which superblock theoretically made possible. And he could do this in the countryside where the garden cities were located, but he couldn't, of course, do it in the city because of the bylaw. So in Letchworth and in some of his other garden city projects and garden suburb projects, he used the cul-de-sac, this passage and pathway, to detach the building line from the street line. And here you can see the cul-de-sac and the buildings inside the city block in Letchworth. And then on the right is a schematic drawing of this, the cul-de-sac itself, and again compared to the bylaw. Now, in another project, which was new in New Earswick, outside of York, Unwin went even further. And here the buildings are almost totally disengaged from the street line. And he theorized the result, interestingly, as a new kind of planning that merged two distinct planning systems. The first was town planning, which was the arrangement of streets outside the block. And the second was site planning, which is the arrangement of buildings and landscape within the block. And together, Unwin argued, they shape the urban form of the Garden City and Garden Suburb. And here's a view of, for instance, the green in New Earswick. There's a plan of it and a view of that interior space. Now, Unwin argued that the same principles could be applied to planning in the city. And that's the argument of this diagram here on the right. And it was that once the building is disengaged from the street, it can be oriented for maximum insulation. And so he recommended a very strict north-south alignment, which would give the buildings an east-west exposure, and also a rectilinear geometry that was appropriate to the city. Now, this diagram was enormously influential on European planning in the 1920s. But the most important aspect of Unwin's heliomorphic site planning that I want to mention before we turn to the German example, and the key actually to its enthusiastic reception and later life in socialist planning, was that for Unwin, solar equity, the democratization of access to sunlight, was part of a larger social and political project to combat the spatialization of class in the city. And Unwin himself argued that the superblock had the potential to develop into a new kind of urban social space. It had the potential to grow into a more complex social and physical unit, and even to become a new kind of commons in the 20th century metropolis, a form of commonly owned urban space that had more or less disappeared from the modern city in the capitalist context. Now, Unwin's ideas and this diagram here on the right had their most immediate influence in Germany. And in particular, his arguments and diagrams resonated with social democratic city building officials in Germany who were dealing with a massive housing crisis in the 1920s. After World War I, and especially with Ernst May, who is here on the right, who was the city architect and planner of Frankfurt, who knew and had worked with Unwin in England. And May immediately grasped the potential of superblock planning for producing a new and more equitable and healthy social and physical urban environment in the new Frankfurt. And you can see here in these images on the left, the extensive program of the new Frankfurt, and particularly on the map. So in Frankfurt, May and his team conducted rigorous research into solar orientation. And here, for example, are these solar orientation studies that are rarely actually mentioned as the generating force for this kind of modernist housing development in Germany in the 1920s. Here on the left, he shows how the building should be aligned at 22.5 degrees from true north-south, and also analyzed the solar orientation of the domestic spaces and activities, that sleeping should be in the west, and living space, in the east, and living spaces in the west. So May also rationalized Unwin's superblock site planning model. And here's an example, the most rationalized version of this housing development in Frankfurt, Westhausen, into a new urban formation, the Siedlung or settlement, which was composed of these a new housing typology that Zeilenbau is called in German, the row house or row block or housing bar, and with standardized dwelling units, which were oriented for optimal insulation. But May and other German city architects were not only concerned with typological innovation, they were also trying to develop new methods of construction and housing production. And they were experimenting with prefabrication systems that you can see here, in particular with the creation of precast concrete panels that were produced in factories on site and assembled by cranes. And you can see that in the images here. And the result was to be a perfect synthesis of nature and technology that combined scientific methods of design and production with natural heliomorphic site planning that could generate urban fabric that had a particular relationship both to site and to social program. And here are some recent images of that development. Now, on the basis of his work, and I'm moving very swiftly through this so that I don't take up too much time here. We're covering an enormous amount of territory, certainly in terms of space. On the basis of his work in Frankfurt, Mai was invited to the Soviet Union in 1930, and he took with him his ideas developed in Frankfurt, and he took along his the Mai Brigade, as they were called, to the Soviet Union. And this is an image of one of the publications of the New Frankfurt with Mai taking off from Germany to the Soviet Union. Now, his task in the Soviet Union was to design a new socialist city, a Sotsgorod, in Magnitogorsk, which was a Soviet steel production center, and at the same time to rationalize the Soviet building industry for the development of serial mass housing. And here is an example of one of the systems he developed, the montage system, which involved rationalization of the building site itself. And this is something that continued through socialist planning. It was not actually implemented, this particular one, but in 1930, Mai designed a general plan for Magnitogorsk. And as you can see here, these massive super blocks with, and I'll show you in a second, with extensive social infrastructure. The housing itself, again, solar insulation, double exposure, housing bars, and also this extensive infrastructure that you can see here. Here is one of these individual super blocks. As you can see, the housing bars, but then also there were childcare centers, kindergartens, schools, communal dining rooms, stores, laundries, and all that kind of thing. In the end, only a very small amount of Magnitogorsk was completed before 1933, when Mai left for political reasons for the Soviet Union, because by that time, Soviet policy regarding urbanization had shifted away from this research-driven experimentalism towards pragmatism and towards Stalinist aesthetics that were also facing up to the economic underdevelopment of the Soviet state, that you couldn't build brand new towns. But in the late 1950s, under Khrushchev, Soviet policy shifted back to modernist design ideas and of this early experimental period. And now they were combined with this massive push to restructure the construction industry through prefabrication and standardized housing typologies. And from 1957 on, the spatial unit of Soviet planning was the mikrorayon, or the microdistrict in English, which was a massively scaled up superblock and Siedlung with an average population of around 8 to 10,000 people. And the system was applied across the Soviet Union and the satellites. And so I'm showing you an example here of a mikrorayon in Baku in Azerbaijan built in 1964. And each one of these microrayons, like the one in Baku, was equipped with social infrastructure to meet the daily and weekly needs of inhabitants. So schools, you could see here, I've translated below some of the legend of this plan here. So there are schools, shops, clinics, sports facilities, libraries, and these were all daily and weekly needs were to be within 10 minutes walking distance of the housing. And less frequent needs like entertainment and culture and so on were to be obtained within the larger rayon. So in general, the structure of microrayons within socialist space, and both in the Soviet Union and the satellites, have followed three parameters. And the first was the social requirements of the spatial requirements, sorry, of the social infrastructure, which I've been talking about, and you can see here on the plan. The second were these insulation norms, which were based on hours of insulation in different time zones within Soviet and socialist space. And the third were the economics of the assembly crane, which had to be positioned so that as many buildings as possible could be operated by a single crane. So together, interestingly, these parameters determined the scale and organization of Soviet urban space from the late 1950s to the late 1980s. They determined its settlement densities, they determined its landscapes, and its everyday practices. And here, just to contextualize this, are a group of the sort of larger collection of micro districts within Baku itself, built in the 1960s. Now, moving to the end here, towards the end of the Soviet period, when much of the social infrastructure and landscape were not built for economic reasons, microRAN planning was dubbed simply crane urbanism, and also superblock planning. So it became crane urbanism. However, and I'd like to end on a very interesting positive note here, that in the post-socialist decades, the 1990s and 2000s, especially in the former East Germany, socialist superbloc received a new life. And I think that among the most interesting developments in recent years in the former East Berlin, and in these socialist era micro-RANs that were built and are now in the inner city, they were built along the wall during the 1950s. And this is the Heinrich Heine district built in the 1950s. These super blocks are being socially reconstituted, and you can see that in the lower register here along the bottom, with insertions of housing and especially of social infrastructure and landscape. And they're creating what I find really interesting hybrid post-socialist, post-industrial urban formations in the center of the city that are, and so Superblock here is once again allowing us to reimagine the city itself. And that's where I'm going to end with this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eve, for that very enlightening lecture and presentation. I'm sure there are so many very interesting concept threads. I'm sure we'll be bring up again later in the discussion. Next, we will have Professor Peter Carl. Peter, now the screen is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, let me see if I can. Are we sharing a screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think if you let your images of pictures go along the top, you'll be able to, most of my stuff is below that top horizon. Thanks very much for the introductions, and thanks Eve for that really interesting tour of the superblock from Unwin to the Central Europe, really. Since at least Vitruvius, design of cities has been committed to urban improvement by concentrating on the attributes of Vitruvius's tragic set. That is to say, aesthetic beauty, geometric clarity, density of reference, higher land values, and so forth. By the early 20th century, urban order had become confused with architectural order, resulting in, for example, Le Corbusier's statistical distribution of privacies in space, or the megastructure, by which Candelas and Woods proposed to replace a bombed medieval quarter in Frankfurt. The protocols of form in space embraced not only industrial construction techniques, but was itself embraced by advanced capitalism in superblocks devoted to the ubiquitous mixed-use malls and culminating in the dreadful Hudson Yards. With the advent of digital resources, the concept of urban form could be subjected to comprehensive parametric description, as in Zaha's proposal for suburban Istanbul. The possibilities of big data live feeds encouraged a view of a whole city as a system of systems. Of course, several aspects of urban life need to be systematic, such as the IT, traffic management, plumbing, and so forth. For the most part, then, when not simply torn down and replaced, Vitruvius's comic set was left to B-movie, policier, and video games. I'm interested in the capacity of superblocks to support the messy order of the comic set, with its openness to a rich diversity of activities, classes, peoples, experiences, conflicts. Since the term superblock invites total architectural description, however, I will refer henceforth to large block urbanism. In this example from Southwark, London, for those of you familiar with London, can you see my arrow? That's the base of the Shard. Has a front to Borough High Street, which you're looking up here to the right in this aerial, made up of the usual shops, residences, ateliers, and offices, with alleys leading to lower rent accommodation, and all of that embraces Guy's Hospital with its very different scale of articulation and decorum. One of the principal virtues of such a block is its capacity to adapt and transform in history. Although interest in such topographies dates back to the 60s, with people like Jacobs, Collins Townscape, Kevin Lynch, Italian hill towns, Mykonos, and most recently Richard Sennett's book on building and dwelling. So in my view, does an incomplete understanding. For example, the promising urban analyses of Tendenza and its attention to the perimeter block arrived in practice to the usual confusion of architectural and urban order, creating blocks of total design completed when the contractor left the site. Similarly, some of the techniques to develop to counter Siam urbanism, such as Rose figure field analysis imported from the Noli plan of Rome, promote an unwarranted division between public and private, often used to argue for a so-called public realm of pavements, parks, and piazzas. Excepting possibly the domestic loo, nothing in a city is purely private. Access is not the measure of public life. Large block comic set urbanism subtly mediates the spectrum from a politically sensitive public to the aggregate of individuals in the crowd. Accordingly, I would like to use examples from Europe to present urban depth as a topography of praxis supporting a cultural orientation, here represented by De Chirico's use of the Castello Estense in Ferrara, roughly speaking from topographic depth to depth of meaning. By symbolic, I'm ignoring capital cities, sorry, Siam, or the cities of priests and princes, although I'd like to call attention to a phenomenon that emerged with the Italian city republics in the late 14th century. Renovatio urbis literally translates urban renewal, but the original meaning encompassed not only infrastructure like canals and docks or architecture, but also charitable foundations, poems, paintings, performances, celebrations, corresponding to a sense of collective life oriented to a higher purpose. Instead of, or in addition to our emphasis upon the rights of the subject or agent and freedom from oppression, we can speak with Nietzsche of freedom for a commitment to some sort of common good, which in our much more extensive city largely takes the form of an anonymous solidarity. Moreover, we do not have a common religion and only a vaguely shared symbolic vocabulary. And so I'm interested in how large block urbanism supports the insights arising from what are generally experienced as fragments, what Joyce called epiphanies, and what Benjamin, speaking of surrealism, called profane illuminations. That is, the sort of situations that attracted Saul Steinberg. I'm here less interested in design prescriptions than I am in how these kinds of topography support a diversity and richness of urban life. This assumes that we construct our contexts for the purposes of orientation and reality. There's an important ethical implication in the notion of good design. Topographically, the most obvious manifestation of depth is the layering. This is a section through this block from the 7th in Paris. The most obvious manifestation of depth is the layering that builds up towards the street, from the interior to the street. The scope of decorum when addressing the street is more narrow than what is permitted in the interior, which can range from a monastery, as in here in Prague, to industry, as in here in Peckham, or an urban farm and so forth. Because rents are usually lower in the interior of the block, large blocks can accommodate call centers, tattoo parlors, ateliers, and so forth, as well as marginally legal activities. These are then brought into proximity with the law firms, the clinics, and commercial life of the exterior of the block. In terms of content, the block makes the street, not the other way around. And it suppresses urban life to define Manhattan or Brienne, for example, as a grid of streets. Looking quickly at a representative block from Eastern Paris, so this is the Place des Nations, the Cour de Vincennes, developed mostly since the 18th century, we can get a glimpse of how large block urbanism accommodates diversity. I'm mainly interested in this portion on the east of what could be considered very large urban block with internal streets. In 1949, this block was mostly industrial sheds with the Church of the Immaculate Conception on the corner. But it also contained the Cité du Débergue, effectively a fragment of a village. The Cité is a 2- and 3-story configuration of little streets and courts or squares, accommodating small-scale industry and residences. The Cité was still intact in 1979. 20 years later, most of the industrial sheds have been cleared. Several of the buildings on the street have been rebuilt, accommodating commercial, office, and residential activities, with the addition of high-rise dwellings in the northwest corner, which you can see here. The Cité persists. 20 years later, still, a Jardin Anglais has appeared behind the Cité du Débergue, and the northeast corner has reverted to small-scale industrial, a builder's merchant. To the east of the Cité du Débergue is a one-street cité called the Cité de Rendezvous, with a restaurant on its corner. Here we're looking up the Rue Rendezvous, that's the church, and this is the opening looking into the Cité. To speak of temporal depth is to reject the notion of time or space in the singular, and to argue firstly that we should speak of temporalities attached to concrete phenomena. A loaf of bread has a different temporal character than a brick wall or a fly. Secondly, these temporalities are stratified. The rapid volatile temporalities depend on the slower temporalities of embodiment. We can use this block off Karlovo Náměstí in Prague as a mnemonic. North is to the right. The site ascends southwards towards Vyšehrad. In the southwest corner is an 18th century Orthodox cathedral of St. Cyril and Methodius, where there's been a church of one kind or another since the early Middle Ages, and where the Czech resistance held out after the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich in World War II. Large institutional buildings, including a palace, are now part of the university, along with the usual collection of 19th and 20th century buildings, including a small industrial complex whose chimney you can just see up in here. Temporal depth responds to an insight of Heidegger from Being and Time, which he never developed further, that, quote, a city gives a direction to nature, as opposed to the usual city versus nature paradigm, which pertains mostly to our habits of consumption. Accordingly, the primordial natural conditions support the regional articulation of center, periphery, and hinterland, or the differences between wealthy and poor districts. This in turn supports the block topography, whose basic outlines can persist for half a millennium or more, which in turn supports the buildings, where those on the exterior of the block tend to last longer than those on the interior, though not always. Skipping momentarily to London, we can see that architectural styles introduce another level of temporality, but also that, for example, this is the inside of that window, by the way. Windows and doors are more temporally volatile than on the walls which support them. Similarly, there are seasonal and daily changes in signs and products, the setting out of cafe tables or awnings and so forth, including the pavement hatch for deliveries in this shot from the East End. The manner in which these topographies embody the memory of a city is processual, arising from the concrete particulars in their stratification, which are both cyclic and historical. A city is like a symbol, remaining the same by renewing itself. This is because praxis is enacted within a spectrum between conflict, negotiation, accommodation, and collaboration that is conditioned by institutional horizons that give rise to the situational typicalities, which I'm emphasizing over the architectural notion of typology to which it responds. By institution, I do not mean only the official institutions like marriage or the postal service, or the protocols of a particular group, whether a law firm or a gang, but more fundamentally, the customs, habits, and languages of mutual respect that enable urban dwellers to get along with each other. These horizons are embodied in the architecture, what is characteristically called decorum, what happens most of the time, and constitute an affordance and a claim. As an affordance, they allow much to be understood without having to be said explicitly or to start from scratch. As a claim, one must adhere to the institutional nuances, even in the violations, such as murder in the cathedral. The already there quality of institutions mean they resonate with the primordial conditions, and the individual is already implicated in the collective order. One is always part of everyone else's background. Similar qualities of concreteness and stratified temporality prevail in typical situations, even at the scale of a room. Our thoughts move faster than our speech, which depends upon our gestures and posture, which depend upon the furniture, which finally depends upon the walls and floor. We equip our context for praxis. Furniture's at the right height and distances and so forth. The work table may be a mess or neat, but is more temporally volatile in proximity to the making or doing. For the most part, the architecture prevails in peripheral vision. I would like to conclude with a brief mention of how the attunement to concrete conditions supports our analogical imaginations. It can happen at the scale of situations. For example, just as a seminar room can host a studio or a workshop, a dinner or a performance, but not a petrol station, the combination of a restaurant and theater produces cabaret, and cabaret's involvement with popular topics and situations allows it to evolve into agitprop. Similarly, the modalities of table as horizon, including the wine cooling fountain at Villalante or the geological water table, point to the manner in which our involvements with things are the basis for analogy and poetics. Instead of subject-object, we should think of ourselves as variously involved in a deep matrix of claims and affordances. We are played by and contribute to contexts that are intersubjective, extended, embodied, processual, and metaphoric. No text by an urbanist or architecture captures these aspects of urban life as well as does the Ulysses of James Joyce. His Dubliners are not like the well-behaved middle class strolling through the architecture on a summer afternoon one finds so often in architectural planning renders. Joyce recognizes that people are characteristically caught up in the agonic negotiations of praxis and only partially understand, indeed often misunderstand, and be kind and cruel, can be angels and demons. The novel takes place in Dublin's background, its comic set, not in the monumental centers. Moreover, Joyce is deeply attentive to how the typicalities of praxis and their involvements with architecture and artifacts generate the analogical conditions for poetics and hence for moral judgments, what I've called symbolic depth. One small example set in a bar in the Ormond Hotel, I don't know if you can, that's this cluster here or that cluster there, is one of several incarnations of house in the novel. So the river is out here, the rest of the buildings, these are both party walls. In the bar, this is a bar, this is a saloon bar, this is a restaurant, and that's the kitchen. And the rooms are up above, going used to it by the stair there. In the bar, with its great horizontal mirror and window to the street, lively banter is interwoven with the singing that's taking place in the saloon behind with its skylight. So this is probably horizontal terrestrial talk, and this is celestial vertical music. The interaction between them generates an impromptu opera in a chapter built around musical analogies. Simon Dedalus is among the group at the bar, and through a door he glimpses Bloom, Leopold Bloom, dining alone, whilst his wife Molly is enjoying an extramarital with Blazes Boylan. Agreeing that Molly had a good singing voice, very, Mr. Dedalus said, staring hard at a headless sardine. Under the sandwich bell lay in a bier of bread, one lonely, last sardine of summer, Bloom alone. This echoes the chorus of a song from the saloon bar, "'Tis the last rose of summer left blooming all alone," but in casting the bread as a bier for fish, suggests the ichthys of Christ, and the reader, but not Dedalus, recognizes the analogy between the dome of the sandwich bell and the Anastasis rotunda Constantine raised over Christ's tomb. In this trajectory from large block urbanism to a stale sandwich, I've tried to suggest firstly, what is in play or what is at stake in an urban order generous towards multiple constituencies, and secondly, how such topographies promote the conditions for a plausible ethical orientation. The scope for reimagining these topographies is considerable, but we ought to be able to do at least as well as these mostly older examples. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that very provocative presentation. Extremely intrigued by your definition and reading of the urban depths, which I'm sure we'll get back to and discuss with everyone here. I think we're running slightly behind schedule, Michael. So maybe we can just open up the discussion now. And I would like to invite Eve, Peter, and of course, Nancy and Jianfei to join the panel discussion now, along, of course, with our Dean Speaks. So if I may, Michael.
Liang, could I just briefly remind people that if they have questions, if they could just put them in the chat and we'll try to respond to them in the chat. And if yeah, we'll try it like that at first. Yeah.
Okay, sounds great.
I mean to say anyone other than the panelists is what I meant to say. Obviously.
Thank you, Michael. Maybe I'll take the stab and I will ask the first question, I guess. Is this something I've been thinking while the Eve and Peter were presenting your ideas. Maybe this is also the starter question for all the panelists today. I wanted to ask, since especially Eve, you have presented a rather kind of comprehensive chronology and lineage of the Western superblock development, and Peter, you have framed this interpretation of urban depths as a critical reading that really entails, as you framed, the notion of temporality, that and also perhaps in relation to the notion of collectivities as well. I wonder, in light of all these historical framing and all the important projects that you have shared with us just now, I'm curious, where do you see that we are now at in terms of the superblock discourse as both a concept and also a practice? And how, I mean, I know this is an open question, but I guess this is just to facilitate the discussion with all of you. And also a following up question for that would be, how could we possibly reposition the superblock discourse today in relation to a larger set of discussion on the architectural and urbanism knowledge? And I know that, Peter, you mentioned in your lecture just now, you're trying to differentiate the urban order and the architectural order. And I'm just basically, for me, I'm trying to get a more understanding and kind of knowledge and thoughts from you in terms of how can we position the superblock discourse today. in relation to the discourse that we are operating within.
Go ahead, Eve.
Oh, okay. I thought that was to you, but I think that, well, it's interesting. I think that what we're trying to do is sort of get away from sort of conventional thinking, or let's say modernist conceptions of things like the superblock, and that the idea that the superblock is a very large scale urban formation, or it can be a very large scale building as well. And that's another component, and that it is, because of its large scale, a very simple thing. And that it is an oversimplification, that it's just an expansion in scale of the block, of the building, and that it lacks depth, temporal and spatial, and also mainly complexity. And I think that what we're doing by looking at it historically, as I think both Peter and I have been doing at different moments and in different contexts, is that superblock is something that allows for enormous complexity and that has existed forever in the city, and that it also constitutes it enables a diversity within the city by and I think that one of the important things here is that it blurs the conventional boundaries between public and private, and that superblock allows that to happen, and that in the modern city, actually, the public space or the streets was the infrastructure, and private space was inside the block. And in fact, that's the way in which the capitalist city developed. That private space was provided by developers within the city block, and the city provided the infrastructure. And so what superblock does in certain circumstances is blur those boundaries. And I think that that's one of the that's an interesting way to think about it, actually. And it's maybe a result of this kind of research.
I'm sorry, could I? I'm sorry, Peter. Go ahead. I was just going to,
go ahead.
I was simply going to follow. Yeah, I was going to follow up with Liang's question, and maybe ask you both a similar question, but maybe slightly more specific. I mean, one of and there's also, I think, a terrific question here from Professor Lawrence Chua that we'll maybe get to if you all. If your eye happens to wander over to the chat, you'll see that question. I think it's directed to Eve. But I have a general question, which has to do with some of the discussions that Liang and I have had about superblock, not so much as a planning reality or even as an instrumentalized thing, but literally, and this is not unlike something that I think Eve just mentioned, almost as an abstract ambition to imagine something large, something big, something like the commons. We all, superblock is a term, as Liang suggested earlier, that everybody is immediately familiar with, but no one can really very well define, because it means so many different things to so many different people. I guess my question is, can we imagine the superblock in some ways not unlike the way that Peter described the ambitions of Joyce as a as an abstract ambition to think the totality of the commons. I wonder if it's part of its efficacy today is not caught up with that, because we don't seem to be able to do that very well. The only way we seem to be able to do that is by referring to literature or to films or to, but planners and certainly developers seem unable to imagine that kind of totality, except unfortunately, I think someone mentioned maybe Hudson Yards, except in this very sterile, absolutely completely defined situation where all the questions and answers have already been put on the table. And I take that to be Peter's sort of counter proposal of what he called large block comic urbanism is a kind of a counter to that model. I guess I've made a statement more than asking a question. What I'm wondering is, to what extent do you all believe that superblock is a real planning and a term that can be instrumentalized, or do you think it's one of the few things we have left that enables us to have the ambition to imagine the totality of community, commons, and such? Because when I try to imagine how to instrumentalize Peter's large block urbanism, I can't think of how to do that. It's a very apt and very powerful description of a complex situation, but how would one, or maybe one shouldn't, instrumentalize that? So I guess that maybe the simple question is superblock today for us more the name of an ambition to think the totality, or is it a real thing that could be instrumentalized and used to plan?
My immediate response is twofold. One, I thought Eve's last slide was moving in the direction of the kind of world that I'm talking about, and the capacity for it to adapt culturally, to adapt historically, to challenge the form and space paradigm, and was beginning to develop. And one could see, I mean, the kinds of urban topographies I'm talking about are, if they're 200 years old, they're young. And being able to negotiate historical change, being able to set the parameters for historical change, being able to keep the kind of urban decorum going while allowing things to adjust, is part of it. The second, just dot for a moment. The second thing is I go into things like large block urbanism and use of literature and movies and plays and so forth, because architecture helps to understand a lot of things that have become very dogmatic recently. Notions of rights, notions of individual identity, the great attention paid to the subject or the agent. And what looking at these large urban configurations helped me understand is that the commons is a highly articulate and actually quite volatile phenomenon with many interlocking parts. That it's not, that while the famous essay about the tragedy of the commons has become, and Elinor Ostrom's response to it has become a kind of touchstone. Curiously, when you go back into, gosh, I've forgotten his name, Hayek, you realize that he's actually dealing with a kind of bottom-up phenomenon. He's dealing with a late 19th century metropolis, not kind of global capitalism. And that kind of, and he goes back and forth. I don't follow all of it, but he goes back and forth between using economic metaphors, the way Joyce uses musical metaphors to deal with various kinds of concrete exchange and what are the conditions. And so I'm at the moment more interested in using large block urbanism to understand these conditions by which we are claimed and to which we contribute. The overemphasis on freedom suppresses the claims. And there's a really rich, and one is part of everybody else's claim. And so resituating that, it's something that's been going on in anthropology now for about 20 years. This is desituating the, or I think that the standard term is getting rid of the anthropocentric nature of knowledge, thinking of it as dialogical, thinking of it as process, thinking of it as something that is much more open to diversity. That one can go too far and lose track of objectivity altogether, and we can get into this some other day. But one of the things that I use large block urbanism for as a touchstone is to get at these larger issues of what is the nature of public, what is the nature of our hurt, how does one get from good as I like it to good as something that is part of, the ethical context.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
I was actually thinking very much of the last example that Eve gave in her presentation. Of course, it depends on the previous developmental framework to evolve and to in time, and maybe that's part of your point. Eve, I don't know if you have a response to that.
Well, yes, actually, what I see as the significance of Superblock now, or this structure, the kind of large scale planning grid, let's say, even. And if you think of a city like Berlin, which has, had one of those since very, very large scale, that it creates a kind of armature that allows for change, actually, that it's a very robust infrastructure that allows for evolution and change within that structure. And I think that that's something that, robust urban form or urban systems and structures are all about, or that is something that Superblock allows, because it is robust, but it allows for smaller scale things. It allows for change. It allows for, depth, and all of those things. So that's what I see as its tremendous potential.
Eve, one more quick observation. I don't know if you happen to see the question in the chat by Professor Chua. Actually, it's a wonderful question because it links the first and the second panel very nicely, and it's something I know that Liang has been discussing with me some, and perhaps with you. It's Professor Chua is wondering about about the cosmological implications of some of Unwin's conceptualizations of the superblocking, the extent to which it's analogous to or similar to certain Chinese understandings of urban planning that are similarly cosmologically informed or driven. I don't know if that's something you wanna speculate about now, or shall we, or that could also be a good question for for Nancy or for yeah, but anyone should please take that on. It's a great question. Thanks, Professor Chua.
Yeah, that's a great question. Just to the last little piece of it, I'm going to leave cosmology to later. But Unwin was definitely very, very much engaged in with pre-modern forms of urban planning, and did very careful analysis, and from a whole range of perspectives. He was not interested in reproducing the forms, although those did get reproduced in the Garden City, largely by his partner, Unwin was the planner, and Parker was the architect. But the idea of the Garden City and even the Superblock, and especially the Superblock, was that it was based on very careful analysis of existing urban and architectural forms, the kind of analysis that Peter was just doing, but then trying to transpose it or to use it for modern design in the modern city. But
I don't know, Nancy, if you want to respond to that
Well,
part.
I have some slides, at least one slide that shows cosmological links to the city. So maybe we'll hold the question till discussion after part 2.
That's good. Well, I do actually, well, Lawrence, again, thank you for the question. We'll definitely catch up on the question. I have one question I've been thinking when Eve and Peter were presenting. And also, Eve, you just mentioned that this notion of urban form, and I know you have done a lot of research with regard to this concept. And for me, if I understood it correctly, Peter, in your presentation, you kind of presented a very implicit critique to the notion of urban form, or to be probably more precise, you didn't use the term urban form, but urban order. So I maybe wanted to get a sense from all of you, the 4 of the panelists here. When we talk about superblock, I guess, can we regard that as a kind of urban form? Or I think maybe a more specific question related to that is, I think part of the dilemma here, the modernist baggage embedded in the term of the superblock, is that on the one hand, it strives for certain kind of very top-down, very clear structure and legibility embedded in the form itself. But at the same time, I think it resists this kind of universal structural or reading information of its project or idea across different cultural and geographic contexts. That's perhaps why I think, Eve, when you present the lineage of the superblock, a different, in a different kind of historical episode, the idea of a superblock manifested in different names or with different formations in different contexts. I wonder if that's, first of all, I guess, would you agree with that observation or my question? And second, I wanted to ask, if that's the case, the kind of the dilemma embedded in the term itself, then how can we maybe tease the latter part out in striving for, as Michael was mentioning, a kind of more abstract thinking and framework of the commons for today and for the future?
I guess I would say that the superblock, I see it more in terms of formation. So as a kind of, I guess it's, what is it, a gerund or something? It's as a something that is a process, actually, and that it involves a strategy and an approach and a design thinking, as well as social. I mean, it's very much involved with social ideas, and it's a social concept. So it is a concept, I think, rather than a thing. And I think that that's really important. And that's the agency of superblock as a concept, that it's something that can contain complexity and contradiction, not to evoke that whole discourse, but that it allows for all of those contestations to exist, and that's what it's about.
Yeah, I reserve superblock for the the kind of design that tries to make a whole organism out of the superblock one way or another, and left large block urbanism to the kind of aggregative transformational processes that I was talking about. And it's certainly the case. I mean, that's, for the sake of 15 minutes, one thing I will say just about my own approach is that I've gone off form and space as the 2 most handy terms to use in architecture, as they overgeneralize everything, and anything concrete needs to be supplied. And so I've been trying to work on a way of thinking architecture that builds up, that is just honest to what are the concrete particulars. And you lose track of time in the singular or space in the singular. They are built out of the relationships and forces, some of which are very long-term, some of which are momentary. But once you get used to that and you realize that you're dealing with claims and affordances and it's a constant negotiation, it becomes a very different way of working. And you don't, the aspiration, to write the Gideon book, to find the concept of concepts, which is what we've been doing since Romanticism, really, probably 18th century. The counterform can go too far. Clearly, you give up all sorts of theorizing altogether, and you just go out and lay bricks. And the need for the nub of it probably has to do with things like, the kind of operation that you see in Hudson Yards is very familiar from, I showed an example from Indonesia. It's very familiar from the rest of the planet, where a developer can capture, and we know that in fact it began in New York with the City Block, where they divided the investment company into 100 different, ghost firms. Each bought a building, and then they got, and there was one lady that held out in the church, blah. I.e., the problem really arises when you talk about instrumentalize and how to make it and how to settle on it as a political institution with all of this richness and complexity, because it's so easy. Well, I say easy, it takes a certain amount of money and courage and so forth to just buy up a parcel of land and say, I'm going to fill it. And you end up with Hudson Yards, and he calls it world class. To me, the mosque at Cordoba is world class, not, duty free and 18 to 24-year-olds and so forth. And he speaks of engagement to the city because of the transparent platform at the 100th floor. The one thing I did learn from him is that restaurant can support the whole building economically. If that's the case, nobody's paying for the kind of thing I'm after. But one of the reasons I go back, poor economics and all this sort of stuff, when you start looking at informal settlements and the way they're funded and how people collaborate and the different ways they can collaborate, these are to me the models of how one can begin to implement a kind of world that allows the architect to have a say, that allows that it doesn't just come up out of, debate is nice. But for example, Asha Min has a nice example of how an architecture school was used to plot out a favela, where they built a model of it, and that became the common ground for people to decide, oh yes, this should be here, it should have a kind of institutional hierarchy, this is where the post office can go, and that kind of thing. And so it allows people to kind of stand outside their city, but also, they're making it there. And so these kinds of strategies intrigue me because they are ways in which it's not simply done by a rich and ambitious developer with all the funds going to an offshore company. In an architecture school, it's quite tricky because, you're grading individual students and they get a great big site and they want to be glorious from the upper left corner to the lower right corner and from 6 stories below ground to 100 stories in the air. And I think the techniques of exploring how to understand these kinds of topographies is a first step to thinking other ways in which they might happen.
Brilliant answer, Peter. I as rich as the material that you're analyzing, and let's say we're giving Joyce a run now. There are 2 quite good questions in the chat. I don't know if either of you have seen them, but one is Professor Borman, who is one of our faculty members here, says, certainly I think Liang asked a question about the status of superblocks and contemporary discourse on urbanism. Certainly I think about the Hope 6 program and its destruction of post-war public housing designed as superblocks is symptomatic of the negative attitudes about superblocks that define the work of American architecture scholarship in the late 20th century, i.e. Oscar Newman, as well as new urbanist thinkers. A very interesting and provocative observation. I wonder if anyone has a response. And then there's another question from Fernando, who is invoking, I believe, Team 10 here, or in part. He's asking about Vandenbroek and Bakema, Chamberlain, Powell, and Bonn, and others have arrived at solutions of middle ground between the neighborhood pattern and fine grain of a balcony. Perhaps that's a bit of a jab, but is there enough commons, room for transformation and collective participation in the solutions? And then another question just popped in, and you all can take any of these. I'm just summarizing them quickly. Benjamin John is asking about the messiness of Chinese development. Does it hold out hope for the superblock? I think we're going to deal with that directly in the next section or session. To save it from Hudson Yards, I was talking about the project of Liu Jiakun's West Village, which is one of the most amazing projects I think one could ever see. As a Peter, now maybe that is your counter example to Hudson Yards. That's probably a very good one. But I don't know. Does anyone have any responses to these questions? I'm going to defer to Liang and say that probably soon we'll want to move on, because but these are all such terrific questions. Any one of the four panelists have an observation or response?
Maybe I also wanted to invite Nancy and Jianfei to, I don't know, make any observation, comment to any of these questions here.
Jianfei, you're muted. There you are.
I just heard about you talking about Liu Jiakun's West Village super block, right?
Yes. Yeah. Well, we were saying if there's a good counterbalance to Hudson Yards, maybe it's that project.
Yeah, I include that slides in my presentation. Anyway.
Okay, so we'll hold that. We'll hold that. We won't jump to your conclusions already. Thank you. What about some of these other questions, though, about the, let's say, contemporary American, well, let's say the negative view of superblocks and large-scale planning and development in the U.S. and the kind of ends that it seems to have come to. And there's I don't know. Anyone have any answers to these observations here?
Or maybe I know that we also need to kind of move on probably in a couple of minutes, but maybe Christina's question. And thank you again for both of the questions. Actually, I just maybe want to follow up on Christina's question, because I think it speaks to the kind of baggages, the kind of conceptual baggages that comes with the superblock terminology and also discourse. And she actually in the question specifically referring to the American context. And I wonder if maybe Eve could respond to this briefly.
Yes, let me see. I think that, the issue here, or what seems to bubble up for me in this question, is about the destruction of public housing in favor of private development, actually. And I think that it's possibly fair to say that a lot of the new urbanist planning and developments are basically private. And so I think that, the public housing is being sort of rejected as for its architecture, rather than for the fact that it's public. And I think that actually there's some very interesting ways in which a lot of public housing, some in the States, a lot in Europe and in Asia and all over the world, actually, housing that was built by the welfare state is being adapted now in various ways. And getting all of the landscape and social infrastructure that are necessary, that were part of the original idea. And that it's not a matter of replicating traditional village forms. That doesn't make a village, actually. It doesn't make a community. And that things, the way things look is not how they operate. And so I think that that's a whole issue. And that foregrounding things like superblock as a way of thinking, as a concept rather than as a form, is one way of getting at this. And I think that's where I would put that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that is an important contribution, because certainly when I was in school and for years afterwards, there was this piety that attached to housing, and they kept calling it social housing. There was nothing social about it. It was people storage. And when you talk about adaptability and people living in, what used to be warehouses, or they're now converting offices because they've got this new idea that people are going to work from home and so forth. And I think the idea that we have an architecture that can adapt, that allows for these different forms. And it's when one talks about dwelling as a civic proposition, it includes things like the plumbing, it includes things like the schools, it includes things and the virtue of, I don't know whether to call it super block or large block urbanism, but at any rate, not all large block urbanism, not any city is all large blocks. They tend to appear in certain areas. And there's a lot of, you look at the center of Padua, is the whole medieval section a large block? Or quite how do you define? So as Liang said at the very beginning, but I think the idea that we have started to think about how part and whole relate to each other, what is a civic order? What does it mean to collaborate? What is inequality? And certainly it manifests itself in the architecture very quickly. Well, it enables a political and social discussion. It can become a vehicle for concern for the ethical issues that I think are too easily solved by just saying housing, with a Z, or simple concepts. I think the more one realizes that it's reciprocal, dialogical, and so forth, the super block is a useful vehicle to get into that kind of thinking in the city. So I would agree with you entirely.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that response. I'm sure, the notion you just brought up in terms of the notion of public versus collective and civic, and also the notion of housing will reappear, I'm sure, in Nancy and Jianfei's presentation in just a minute. So Michael, I think it's probably a good time for us to move on to the second panel. Now I would like to invite Professor Nancy Steinhardt to give her 15 minutes presentation. Now the screen is yours, Nancy.
Okay, and I think everyone can see the screen, is that right?
Yes.
I'm trying to get the slideshow. I'm looking for slideshow up here or down here. Did that work? No. Let me go.
It's the third from the right on.
Got it. I got, yeah. Now let's see. There we go. Okay, we have it. So one of the most provocative exercises in which we all engage in our environment of global studies is to take a seminal concept, or in this case, I have it on the screen for you to read, a passage from a seminal work by field-defining scholars, and see if it applies to another context. What I did here for a period in which I focus, which is period of Chinese late antiquity, 4th through 6th centuries, is to take a passage from Brown, Bowersock, and Grabar's late antiquity and substitute Han for ancient Rome and China's classical age for ancient Greece and Buddhism for Christianity as an overview of what happens in China's late antiquity. Today, I turn to superblock, which, truth be told, is not a term that I've ever used in writing or really even in conversation. until thinking about it for the last few months when Liang invited me to give this talk. But this is the definition of superblock that I'm using. And I'm going to see if I can build a case for the use of superblocks in pre-modern Chinese planning. The best evidence of pre-modern Chinese cities comes from capital cities, and more specifically from cities that are used and built by rulers. These are cities financed and organized as single entities. They have individual entities in them. As I began to read about superblocks and other materials that were sent to us for today, I came up with what probably anyone on this Zoom would have come up with, that I should start with the capitals of the late 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries of Sui Tang China, Chang'an on the right, and Luoyang on the left, cities of large units of varying size that function, at least in part, these units, known as wards, function at least in part as separate or individual entities, and I'll call them wards. There were 108 plus 2 markets in Chang'an. There were 104 in Luoyang. They were not financially independent, but because some were wealthier than others, but each had its own gates, its own guards, and a certain degree of autonomy. They were conceived of as independent, not just by name, but by what occurred in them. So some might focus on a palace, some on a mansion, some on a religious institution, some would be purely residential, and each one divided into 4 parts, and then the city of Chang'an subdivided again into another 4 unless blocked by something like a palace or a mansion, so that we have 16, in principle, equally sized units. Each ward opened at dusk, opened at dawn, closed at dusk, had at least 2 gates with guards, most had 4, and the markets opened at noon and closed at dusk. But wasn't necessary for a resident to leave her ward in order to shop. This is something that I can't answer. I'm not sure the documentation is there. It is certain that a city like Chang'an had markets that were very different in character. The one on the east for the wealthier population, the one on the west where more exotic goods could be purchased, where more languages were spoken. And this was true in cities of 1 million. You're looking at a city of 1 million on both the right and the left out of a population of 50 million people in China in the Tang Dynasty, and Chang'an on the Chang'an, which is what you see here, was the larger. So is what I'm saying, is what I'm showing you more than a compelling visual comparison? Well, the first thing that we have to note is that orthogonal planning is fundamental to China for millennia. So we can go back to the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE on the left, or into the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE on the left. We can go to the 3rd century CE on the right and see that the cities indeed were divided into wards. Same thing for a city that flourishes only for about 40 years on the left. I have the dates under them. Another city with a 27-year history on the right, and continuing beyond the city of Chang'an, so 940s to 1126 below, and you have the dates above, and the city on the right that again has a fairly short history, built by a non-Chinese government, which is the same as the city on the lower left, had 62 wards. And this is documented, and every ward is named. And so it's not surprising that the same kind of organization of a city continues under Mongolian rule, top left, continues in the city of Beijing today. And the city at the bottom of the screen, not a very well-known city, but also Mongolian rule in Inner Mongolia today, is a city that was built with this principle of division into wards. So with this in mind, I then tried to ask questions about Chinese cities, which I consider crucial to understanding pre-modern Chinese cities, and put them out there for discussion. So pre-modern city must have water flowing through it. A super block is going to need a water source or water has to come in, but it's not an issue in the 20th century, at least in the cities that we've seen so far today, as it was in pre-modern China. But something else which is a fact in pre-modern China is that cities develop on sites with extremely long multi-millennial history. So Luoyang and Chang'an that we've talked about both have histories of urbanism into the second millennium BCE, if not earlier. Building order is always crucial in a Chinese city or urban environment. I don't know enough about modern super blocks to know if something comes first and then there's a building order. But in China, if it's a city where there's any kind of government, but the imperial city on the screen is kind of our main example for this afternoon here. The palace comes first, and then the place called the imperial city where there are offices that help the government, and then the outer perimeter comes last. But the city is conceived and quickly built from the beginning if it's built anew. Might use some new parts, but the wall of the city of Chang'an was 36.7 kilometers or 84 square kilometers, was completed by February 8th of 583. This is before the short dynasty Sui even conquered all of China and unified it under that empire. The Chinese wall, China always requires walls. Many of you on the screen, I think, speak Chinese, and you know that the character for city and the character for wall are the same. China's earliest evidence of what we call a city, and now I'm in the 5th, 6th, even into the 7th millennium BCE, is a wall. If one sees a wall, one envisions a complete wall, if not quadrilateral, complete, and then something that happens inside of it. Chinese cities also have gardens. This is, and so green space, I know from my readings, been reinforced already in the first two talks. Green space is imperial only in pre-modern China, but green space breaks out in the 20th century so that old imperial spaces like the altar to sun or the altar to moon are today popular green spaces, that is for the public. Wards, as I mentioned, were heavily guarded, and the purpose is to control population. And this is true all the way through the last version of Beijing before the walls come down. And so there are famous stories of escape from wards. This is one of the famous ones. It happens in 627. A Buddhist pilgrim wants to leave China to go to sacred places in India. He does it by sneaking out of the capital. That's illegal, but then after a number of years, he makes it back and he's honored for what he found out and the information he brings back about Buddhism. So control of population, I think, is not a purpose, but maybe this is also something that we can talk about when we talk about super blocks. A timekeeping device. In any Chinese built environment, but one, let's say, that we call a city, there should be a timekeeping device somewhere. So this is from what the relief that you're looking at is from the 2nd century CE. But this is a tower, and it could just symbolize the market space or marketplace, but it probably is a bell tower or a drum tower so that the device inside is rung or is beaten to announce the intervals of time, approximately 2-hour watches in the day. The wards in Chang'an tend to be segregated, or at least to self-identify themselves by population. And so I put up some pictures of foreigners, figurines that were made during this dynasty called Tang. Is multiculturalism an aspect of the superblock? In other words, I'm trying to put out ideas that lend to discussion to see if, in the end, we're dealing with visuality or if we're dealing with something which is more of a concept. Religious institutions. The city of Chang'an had, in Tang Dynasty, had 200 Buddhist establishments and nearly 50 Taoist establishments, and religious architecture of Church of the East and Manichaeism and Zoroastrianism at least. That would mean on average, there would have been at least 3 religious institutions in every ward. The city of Luoyang in the dynasty called Northern Wei, late 5th into the year 534, had 1,376 religious institutions. We don't want to call it a religious city, but worship, prayer, or whatever the 20th century equivalent is always fundamental to Chinese urban concept. The concept of ward goes forth from China across East Asia. And we've heard already the beginnings of the concept of superblock in England, goes to Germany, goes to Russia, goes to China. So there is a parallel here in terms of an urban plan divided into wards. The concept goes to Japan in the 7th century. It exists in the 8th century. It continues in the 9th, 10th centuries and on. This Heian capital is the predecessor of the city Kyoto today. If you've been there, or to Nara, you know that the wards are still very much intact in some of the major streets, but it also leaves China the idea of division into 4-sided enclosures with functions, exists in Northeast Asia among a kingdom known as Parhe. And so this, depending on where one comes from, this is the northern part of Korean history. This is also a part of Russian history. This is also a Northeast Asian empire, and it exists in Mongolia. So 4 cities in Mongolia today under excavation, but excavated enough so that it is certain that their dates are 10th, 11th into the 12th century. And every one not only is 4-sided with major gates, but is divided into 4-sided enclosures with wards. So the question that I could have put on the screen is, the 20th century superblock a microcosm of the city in which it is positioned? Because the notion of ward is that it be a microcosm of the greater city around it. In terms of superblocks in China, I think we might say that the most important defining aspect would not be the superblock itself, but what happens inside of it. And I'm not sure that, in other words, this is what I gather from my small understanding of superblocks. I'm not sure that this is so fundamental in China. What is fundamental is that there is a textual basis for so much urban planning in China. In China, one of the field driving questions is whether every city which is a capital, not even necessarily the capital of the nation, but the capital of, say, a province, whether it derives from a plan that's described in a text that was first promulgated at the very end of the 2nd millennium BCE, and the version that we have is from right after the year 0, maybe the 1st century CE. It's called the ruler's city, and it is supposed to be a square, and it is supposed to have 3 gates on every side, and is supposed to have major north-south and east-west thoroughfares emerging from those gates. And it is supposed to have a palace and residence for the ruler, and markets, and a temple to the ruler's ancestors, and altars to soil and grain. and it was designed by the brother-in-law of the ruler for whom the city was built. There is documentation that this kind of city with a marked center, and that marked center is right here, and this says Center Pavilion, and the pavilion was built over a stone which has the words center marker on it. This is the design that was proposed and implemented for Kublai Khan. Again, the Mongol is more orthodox in his practice of Chinese imperial planning than many Chinese emperors who come before him, but the north-south and the east-west walls were measured and are equidistant from this center marker. But we can associate text with many with many of the most important, or maybe I should say with the most important Chinese imperial spaces. So the city of Chang'an has at least some 6 of the east-west streets have been associated with the Book of Changes. I should have labeled this here. These are the fundamental trigrams of the I Ching, or the Book of Changes. And you can see how someone would play around with the space inside the wards that aren't marked on my plan on the right and see if the configurations of the trigrams fit in. The alignment with stars. So here's the one slide that I brought in, but there are other examples, has always been used or has been used since very early times as an explanation for why the city that we already saw, the city of Chang'an in the 2nd and 1st century CE, had the unusual configuration it did. It still had major north, south, and east-west streets. The concept of wards is less developed, although I consider it the beginning, but the Big and Little Dippers are very much present if you like the plan. A second capital that was built for Kublai before he came to the city of Beijing had monasteries at 4 cardinal directions and at 4 of the corners, and most of them have now been excavated and verified, and these 8 derive from 8 of the trigrams of the I Ching. So again, Book of Changes looms very large. So I have the question here that Lawrence Chua already asked us: does the layout of the superblock ever conform to a star group or to a text? So we can have experts from outside the China field address that question. I show this picture to emphasize that we can't conflate orthogonal planning with the assumption that what happens within the wards or within the orthogonal lines is always an independent entity like a ward in the city of Chang'an. At the same time, this concept of grid planning also has a textual basis, and it traces to the 3rd century CE. And so I have the name Pei Xiu on the screen. He was an official of the 3rd century of the kingdom called Wei, and he promulgated 6 points for cartography, 6 fundamental principles for how to draw a map. And he said that every map should be drawn on a grid or using a graticule. These are not his maps. These are later maps of area that he himself mapped. What they show is that even if there's a lot of space that doesn't really need to be filled in, the surface on which someone begins should be this grid pattern. And scholars said that probably he was relying on someone who lived from 78 to 179 CE, a scholar named Zhang Heng, but actually the use of scale in planning now traces to around 300 BCE, and this bronze plate, which is just under a meter by just under half a meter and about a half a centimeter thick, has scale in the planning of 5 funerary temples inside 2 walls. So Pei Xiu was working with a concept that is even earlier than his own time. Another phrase that one uses when we talk about Chinese urbanism is hierarchy of space. And this is something which probably in principle doesn't lend itself to the discussion of the superblock, but here's what's meant in China. So I asked, can the same superblock span enough time for there to be political or institutional change? And my example here is the city of Luoyang. And on the left, you're looking at it during the dynasty of Eastern Han, so 1st and 2nd centuries CE. And what is inside, the most important space in this city is occupied by an imperial institution called the Luminous Hall, that's for ritual and other functions. A few centuries later, when we get to around the year 500, the same space, so this is where the palaces are then, this is where the palaces are here, becomes occupied by one of the most important, probably the second most important imperial monastery. The most important monastery is actually outside the city walls. So this question then is, if space is designed as a superblock in 1920 and it still is used in 1980, do important spaces remain those important spaces? Now, where this all begins to break down is that there was a line in something that I read about superblocks that said that spaces don't compete with one another. Now, here's the fact of China, and then we decide what to do with it. In China, buildings don't compete with one another in principle because the same design is so omnipresent. So no labels here. Only someone who reads Chinese knows that this building is Taoist and this building is Buddhist. No labels here. This is funerary. This is a temple for Confucius. This is the Hall of Supreme Harmony. Same principles still apply in a building inside a garden or even in residential architecture. So this idea of space not competing in China until the system breaks down means that the structures don't compete even if they are recognizable. So again, if I am reading what superblock is the wrong way, this will lend itself to discussion. What happens in China when, and this is my 20th century example. This is still true in the early 20th century in China. This conflation or convergence of an architectural style for multiple functions. So this is a drawing that was proposed in 1918 to Henry Murphy for Fujian Christian University, and it was never built, but this is a church with chapel or space around the main chapel. And this is the Sun Yat-sen Auditorium in Guangzhou. I'm sure some of you have been there, built in 1926 by one of the architects trained in Beaux-Arts style in China. And it is a central octagonal structure with projections on each of the four sides. So one still has this conflation of a building type, and this will be true in universities when they're built in the 1920s and 1930s also. This will have to be dealt with in superblock construction. I didn't bring in any Hutong. Professor Zhu Jianfei and I didn't talk to each other before writing what we decided to talk about, but I thought Hutong might come up in your talk. But I just wanted to bring in some images of self-contained architectural entities that function as superblocks, but the ones I bring in all have pre-modern origins, as does Hutong. So one of them would be Kejia construction in places like Fujian, where everything that happens within this construction. I probably should have put this earlier because I started to mention it. What happens if the city grows or necessity grows? and a person moves beyond the confines of the ward or the city, walls are extended. So that when a wall, and this is the city of Kaifeng and circa 1000 to circa 1270-ish, circa 960 on, the walls encompass the population. And when the population grew, the walls grew. And so this super block concept, if it existed, has to move with the walls. Similarly, the city of Beijing grows. When the walls don't encompass enough space for what's necessary for the city to function, not the super block, but the macrocosm around a neighborhood, 1550s, a wall is built, and then it will include these two ritual spaces that come up in a minute. Other things I want to throw out for discussion: could the ring roads be conceived of as super blocks? They were not planned that way, but Beijing and other cities in China now have rings for traffic flow around them. The Greater Shanghai Civic Plan of the late 20s, but really 1930s, modeled after not City Beautiful, that was a thought at one time, but probably after something like Canberra, probably was conceived of as a kind of super block, even though that's not in the literature about it. I think the concession districts that begin before the year 1900, begin after the first Opium War, Tianjin, Hankou, Shanghai, Guangzhou, etc., can be compared to superblock conception. And I end here with a neighborhood in Beijing, but which is a neighborhood that dates to the year 1414, or at least a mosque which has been refaced, but dates to the year 1414. This is the Flower Market Mosque, which is in the Chengwen district of Beijing. So here's Chengwen Gate, here's Flower Market Mosque. The area that you see here today is 16.46 square kilometers. This is the altar of heaven that we just saw. So here I'm on the east side of the main axis of Beijing, and this is the city that was extended in 1553. Flower Market Street functioned not only because paper flowers were sold there, but because wood was processed for construction in the Forbidden City. There was a temple to the fire god. There was Long'an Monastery, which is one of the largest in the city of Beijing. Those existed in the 15th century. Saturn Peach Taoist Monastery comes in 1662. There's a kitchen god temple. There's a Methodist church all before the year 1900. So I'm up here, and here's the altar of heaven. And if you walk outside Flower Market today, there are still a few hutong that reflect the fact that in the 1920s, education took place in the mosque, but other activities of the neighborhood that didn't necessarily have anything to do with Islam could use the mosque for their space. Two of the most famous Peking duck restaurants are in this neighborhood. This is the Fire God Temple. There is a fire station across the street, but the temple stands because it was a necessary requirement of the neighborhood, and then a fashionable shopping mall and 3 subway stations within just a few blocks. So this is one example of a Ming Dynasty neighborhood that I think continues to superblock status. This is my last slide, which I guess is a segue for Zhu Jianfei's talk, but construction in China is very much on the level, I think, of superblock. I'm not sure that Alibaba headquarters or Tencent seafront towers use the term, but these are workspaces, which are green spaces, which are also offer opportunities for living and all aspects of life within a short distance the workspace that might employ 10 or 20,000 people. So the real question for talk like this is what is required to call two entities similar or the same? Memesa studies emphasize that any translation cannot be the same as its source, that even mirror images transpose the original. So perhaps discussion of pre-modern Chinese origins of the superbloc is an example of Derrida's differential ontology, that is, difference is fundamental to constructive thinking about and understanding sameness. What I am really saying, I think, is that one can build a case for the Chinese origins of the superbloc in cities with histories that are 2 or more millennia old. But I'm open to being convinced in the next hour that the evidence of the Chinese superbloc in pre-modern times is primarily visual and not ideological or sociological, as it should be for the understanding to really work.
Wow. Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you, Nancy, for that very insightful and very comprehensive overview of the empirical Chinese urban planning. Very intriguing, the archival materials you presented. And also thanks to your very thoughtful questions along your presentation. I'm sure they will overlap with maybe some of Jinfei's arguments and questions, and which we'll get back to later altogether. So thank you again, Nancy. And now I would like to invite Professor Jinfei Zhu to give his presentation. Jinfei, the screen's yours now.
Can you see my screen now? Yes? Yeah?
Yes,
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah? Yeah?
all good, loud and clear.
Okay, so I would like to drive the conversation slightly away from the more specific discussions about superbloc, and I like to invite you to think at another level that is still associated with superbloc, but something to do with magnitude and scale. So my title is An Imaginary of Big Data. All right, so I like to make some observation first. The phenomenon of superblocks in China is possibly to do with various forces, various influence or impact. The first one is the socialist state and its political operational practice. The second one is, of course, related. It's a very top-down, very bureaucratic approach to everything it does, including urban planning. And thirdly, it's possibly to do with its a long imperial tradition, which Nancy has described in the talk. Now, I would like to look at it from another point of view. I like to see the issue from a broader context about scale and magnitude in the nexus between cultural tradition on the one hand and the political practice on the other. And I need to make some differentiation and some observation here as a kind of preparation for that. So firstly, I like to make some, firstly, I would like to say that cultural tradition and the politics of the state as it is running today are not directly related, not necessarily directly related. For example, the Korean tradition does not necessarily lead to North Korean political system, nor the South Korean political system. So the current political system today and the cultural tradition of the past, there's not necessarily a direct or complete relationship. That's the first observation. The second is culture itself, or cultural tradition, remains a separate and powerful category. So we do need to look at tradition and cultural tradition on its own as something important. And thirdly, I like to say that cross-cultural comparison may still be revealing and useful, although we have to construct the comparison carefully. And I'm aware that all comparison is selective and somehow driven with some ideas, but I still want to do it. And I hope that I'm fair and neutral, but I do want to use comparative methodology to bring the conversation to an international platform. So it's not just a local specific case, but hopefully it is an international conversation. Okay, so I would like to start with a comparison of Rome and Beijing in terms of its morphology. So my next slides, okay, let me move on. So I like to make a comparison of Beijing and Rome. Beijing after 1553 and Rome after 1700. That's about a period when Beijing reached its last morphological shape before late 19th century, early 20th century upheavals of revolution, modernization, etc., etc. So Beijing after 1553 is, if you like, it's the last stage of urban form of Beijing. In Rome, I hope to be about the same time of 1700. After 1700, I think it reached the last stage of its Baroque development until 19th century, 20th century upheavals of other things, development, modernization. So I'm comparing these two cities about their in terms of their form. Okay, now if we walk into these two cities, what are we seeing? If we walk into Beijing of that period and Rome of that period, what do we see? This is what we will see if we are arriving in Rome around that time and Beijing. So if you are in Rome, what you will see a lot of tall buildings. Okay, mostly they are 45 meters high, and the highest is as 140 meters at the highest point. So Rome is a city of lots of tall objects, obelisk, church, etc., etc. And there are also broad space in front. However, if you walk into Beijing, what you will see here are essentially a low-rise fabric, and they're mostly about 7, 8, 9 meters, most of it, or 10 meters. The highest point is about 30, 35, 50, 40. So basically it's a low-rise with some high point, of course. So it's a city of low-rise fabric with small spaces, with laneways and courtyard or hutong. Now that's only one side of it. If my next slides may shock you a little bit, if we look at Beijing and Rome from another point of view, you might be very surprised. This is Rome and this is Beijing of that time period. So Rome is about 13 square meters. So although it's very tall with big, tall buildings, it is actually relatively small. Whereas Beijing, although it's very small scale and low rise with small spaces, it is actually huge. It's very, very large. It's 60 square meters in its planning. Okay, so in its actual form after 1553. So Rome is small, but with tall objects, and Beijing is large, but with very low rise. But I use the word small in quotation mark. So it is a question of what do you mean by small and what do you mean by large, okay? So to summarize, this is Rome, relatively small but very tall buildings. And this is Beijing, very large, but very flat and low rise, like this. So one is, if you like, following the idea of object. It's a city of objects, a small organic city of tall objects in the case of Rome. And Beijing is a very large planned city of micro fields and micro cities. So that is the difference. So what we are really seeing here is two different ideas of largeness, two different ideas of magnitude or scale This is, yes, it's very big, but it's big in another way. Rome is very big, but in its own way. Beijing is very big in its own way. So here you have a very special sense of largeness. It's very large, but it's also very small in a particular way. Now, that invites us to see the problem of largeness. It looks like the problem of largeness is not a physical problem on its own. It's a cultural logic, which is quite tricky, and it has different compositions in different cases. So with this question in mind, I'd like to move on to make three comparisons. I like to make three comparisons. One is Weiqi or Go in Asia, East Asia, a game in Asia versus chess in Europe. The first comparison is about gaming. The second comparison is about painting. The landscape scroll painting in Asia, in East Asia, and the Renaissance painting in Europe. And the last one is Chinese writing versus European writing, Chinese characters, comparing to European spellings of words. Okay, so there's three comparisons to see, to explore further about the concept of largeness or scale. So the first one is Weiqi versus this Weiqi being used, played for a long time, for thousands of years in East Asia, in China, Korea, Japan. And here is a chess being played for a long time, at least since Renaissance in Europe. What do we see? I mean, there's a lot of comparison we can cover, but today I'll only say something very basic. So chess, if you look at the spacing of the two, chess has 8 times 8 positions and it has 16 plus 16 pieces. So 16 pieces for one side, 16 for the other. So whereas Weiqi is spatially, not physically, not the physical dimension, but the concept or the structure of Weiqi involves 19 lines and 19 lines here and 19 lines here. So it has 361 points or positions where you can potentially put a piece on. And one side has 180 pieces, another side has 181 pieces. So it's, it's 361 pieces altogether. So if you're playing chess or if you're playing Go or Weiqi, it's a very different concept of space. Relatively speaking, Weiqi is more about cloud, more about group phenomenon, like a flock of birds flying across the sky. What you see is a very large scale movement. So it's very, but when you put a piece down here or down there, you need to be very microscopic in your observation. In other words, when you're playing with Weiqi or Go, it involves a wider range of scaling. So you have to see a very big picture. You also have to scale down to see a very small observation. And then you have to come back to see a larger observation. So of course, both games involve the shift of scaling. But in the case of Weiqi, it involves a wider range of scaling. You have to move from the very large to the very small and back to the very large. The range or the gap is very broad, if you like. So that's the case of gaming. In the case of painting, I'm looking at European Renaissance figural painting versus Chinese landscape painting of Song Dynasty, and which is very well known today, that everybody knows that European Renaissance painting, in this case, for example, Last Supper, 700 times 880 centimeters by Leonardo da Vinci. Here is a Chinese landscape painting. It's called 10,000 Li of Rivers and Mountains. It's about 51 centimeters, but it's 12 meters long, but only half meter high. So it's a scroll, you unfold it slowly over a long time. So if you compare these two paintings, and if you want to figure out the spatial structure of these two different traditions, in the case of Renaissance, what you have here is a perspectival painting with one focus, one center, about one moment. Whereas in the Chinese case, in the Song Dynasty landscape painting, it's not perspectival, or you can say super perspectival, in the sense there are many, like this, the whole painting, about 12 meters long, and you really have to read it over a long time, because it's not about one moment, it's about a cinematic unfolding over a long time, over time. Whereas this is about one moment, this is about many moments. So it's super perspectival or non-perspectival. It's about multiple centers, multiple moments, about some kind of endlessness. And it's also about large and small, about broader range of scaling. So you can see it is a very broad landscape, but you can also zoom in to see details where you see individual people and buildings and boats here and there. So there's a lot of details going on there as well. Okay, so this is about Chinese painting. My next comparison is about writing, Chinese writing. So here, of course, kanji is used in East Asia, but mostly in China first. And if you look at European writing, it has limited number of alphabet. So every word is made up of the composition of a limited number of alphabet. So it's quite logical, and it's kind of logically clear. Whereas if you look at this is Chinese, this means Hanzi. Okay, you can read it this way, but anyway, Chinese words are square in shape, and it's a kind of visual diagram. Now, if you learn Chinese words, there's no alphabet and there's no letter. There's no basic element for you to grasp, like an alphabet, and then you can compose them. It's not quite like that. Although they tell you that, the teachers will say there are 214 radicals, but the words are not really made up of radicals. You can't just memorize a radical and make a composition. When you learn Chinese words, you have to learn it. Words have to be learned as singulars. Every word is an absolute given. You have to learn the word as is. You cannot say how it is composed. Whereas English words, every word is composed of limited letters. In the Chinese case, you have to learn every word by itself, arbitrarily. So you have to learn at least several hundred words to become kind of know about it, and to begin to use it, and to begin to see some regularity. What I'm saying here is that Chinese words has no clear regularity, whereas European words has a clear regularity. So when you learn Chinese words, you have to learn a vast collection of absolute signs or singulars. And therefore it cultivates a view or mind of a lot. You have to memorize a lot. It's about excessive data. So I think people growing up in East Asia, they're trained over a long time to be accommodating and accepting of a large set of data, which means they are not necessarily always very critical. On the other hand, they tend to be accommodating of a lot of information. Okay, so it's also about magnitude, about a lot of information. So let me come back to Chinese painting. I think Chinese painting perhaps is the best summary of a certain aspect of Chinese culture, or a culture in East Asia. So landscapes grow again. It's illustrating a different mindset about big information or big data, of multiplicity, of a lot of information. It's possibly a mental map, visually speaking. It's a mental map of cultures in East Asia and China. And if we indeed using Chinese landscape painting as a map, as a mental map, then we can develop a few observations. Maybe it is a culture about multiplicity or excessive multiplicity, but that word has a lot of meanings if I use Chinese culture as a reference. It means, firstly, a very large set. It's about a lot of things, but also as one thing. It's about one as well as many. It's a set. It's about one as well as multitude, or multitude as well as oneness. That's one aspect of this mindset. The second aspect of this mindset is profusion or quantity or a lot of information, too many, if you like, or endlessness. And the next aspect, which I put in a bracket, and I'm not quite sure yet, but we can discuss about it, is about tolerance of difference, but I'm not quite definite about it. But the word multiplicity can either mean a lot, but also means a lot of different things, right? So there's a problem of difference, but is this also a culture of accepting tolerance and tolerance of difference? That's a question to be asked. But the next one is the culture of excessive multiplicity has another key message here, or key aspect, and that is a very wide range of scaling. This kind of mindset allows a wide range of scaling or rescaling from the very small to the very large and back to the small. So the very large and the very small can be accommodated in a broad range of scaling. So, so if I'm right, then I'm saying that we are seeing in East Asia a different culture here, a culture of big data, a culture that can accommodate a lot of information. It's also about an imaginary of big data and big city. And it's about grandeur and scale and magnitude. It is a culture or mind that can accommodate broad majesty as well as micro intensity. So it's about big and small. It's about the very large and the very small. So it may provide ideas for dealing with the issues of superblock. For example, superblock is always considered as something too big, inhuman, no scale, sorry, no detail, no complexity. But if you follow the idea, then if you follow this Chinese or East Asian idea of scale and big data or big about majesty and local intensity, then it can accommodate local intensity. So this idea of magnitude is not a rejection of detail. Again, this is Chinese painting which I cited, A Thousand Li of Rivers and Mountains, but that's another painting which has lots of details about the same time in Song Dynasty. But even this painting, of course, this painting is about city, but this painting is about landscape, but both painting reveals lots of details. And my last example is Liu Jiakung's case. Now there is not necessarily any direct connection, but there might be some connection between the tradition in the past and the practice today. And this example may demonstrate that a very large building can also accommodate local intensities and local qualities in smaller scale. So the whole idea is about accommodating both the large and the small in this sort of a Chinese approach to the idea of scale and magnitude. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jinfei, for a very inspiring presentation about from more of a cultural construct perspective. Very helpful and intriguing. So now I would like to invite, of course, Jinfei and Nancy, as well as Eve and Peter, to join back the conversation. And maybe Michael, do I have the permission to open up the discussion?
Yeah, I think that's. No, you open it up. It's your symposium.
Because I took the first chance. I just wanted to ask.
No.
Anyhow, I do have a lot of questions actually, and maybe I'll start with.
I should say, Leon. I should also say that it appears that Professor Chua has a number of questions too, all of which are quite provocative, and maybe after. Leon, maybe after you ask your question, maybe we just let Professor Chua ask his question in person and not so that we don't don't reproduce it and foul it up.
Different way, yes, by all means, of course. Thank you for that, Michael, and thanks for the questions, Lawrence. So maybe I will start with a question that actually occurred before this conference. So Nancy actually one day wrote to me in an email and said she was struggling with convincing herself that a kind of superblock ideology exists in the pre-modern Chinese urban history. And so I guess that's a perfect, I think, struggle and to open up the entire conversation, because for me, I feel like I'm still, of course, in the process of defining the path for my own research related to the superblock research, superblock topic. But I'm also equally curious to hear and to see, for example, Nancy, what exactly are you struggling with in terms of defining this ideology? Or in other terms, I feel like Jianfei is, on the other hand, in his presentation, is trying to define or frame a kind of ideology, but it's something that is not directly related to the superblock, but rather something I think above it. It's more of a more cultural kind of construct than something that is directly related to a spatial and communal construct. And I wonder what's your take on that, Nancy and Jianfei.
You want me to start?
Sure, please.
Superblock is, as I understand it, a modern concept. We can start modernism in the late 19th century. We can define it in the 20th century. We can even take Chinese modernism as circa 1920 to 1950 and then switch it to the word contemporary and then switch it to the word very, very contemporary or Dongdongdai. So the pre-modern China carries a lot of baggage. And I don't know how much of it can be discarded for these comparisons to work. Chinese urbanism is, I would say, an elite concept in pre-modern China, into which the population has to fit in or it doesn't fit in. And I'm not going to go down the route of slave society. I'm not going to use, that kind of verbiage. I'm just going to say that a city is built by rulers to serve them. And I'm not sure that superblock fits. I guess that's the fundamental issue, is if superblock is indeed a 20th century concept, then it requires a lot of translation. Take any definition from translation studies that you want. It requires a lot of translation, I think, for it to fit. So as I said, I'm happy for people to convince me I'm wrong, and maybe people who have seen what the cities that I've looked at agree.
Jianfei, do you have any response to that?
Yeah, my presentation do not really directly deal with the issue of superblock. I think I was dealing with the problem of scale. I was talking about scale, like when I look at Beijing and I measured Beijing versus Rome in terms of height and width. So I was looking at scale and dimension, but I'm not dealing with this concept of superblock, which is a constructed word, which A, I'm not expert, B, I sort of avoid it. I avoid it because, I'm happy that you guys talk about it, and I contribute from the point of view of something else, like physical scale, physical dimension, and why Beijing and Rome look so different. When I would compare the size, I was shocked. I compared again and again, and Rome is very small, Beijing is huge, but Rome is very tall, and Beijing is very low-rise. So anyway, I'm not dealing with the problem of superblock on its own, but I was looking at culturally, if you like, various. I am in the issue of scale and magnitude as a cultural concept as well as a physical concept. Another idea that I didn't talk about, and Nancy probably can share with us, that is feng shui is a huge idea. Feng shui, you know feng shui, right? Feng shui. When you design, when you allocate like a village, you have to look at mountains at far away. So feng shui is a very large thinking, feng shui. And feng shui and painting is also related. And that's also concept of landscape, which is a very different idea. And China embraced landscape very early. That's why it has feng shui practice as well as Chinese landscape painting. Whereas landscape in Europe came perhaps quite late. Anyway, so there are a lot of issues there, but when I was using the word feng shui, I was thinking about scale, because feng shui is a huge scale in terms of its practice. Yeah, so
Maybe.
Leon,
Sorry.
oh, can you hear me? Yeah, Leon, to go back to what you asked me, I think that one of the purposes of Chinese space is to control population in pre-modern space. And my understanding of Superblock is that it offers opportunity for the population rather than control. Socialism on some level, which then gets defined as Marxism and has a different purpose in Azerbaijan and in 1950s China than it does, say, in 1910 or 1920 in Western Europe. That's probably my fundamental problem with it. And yes, what Professor Zhu was saying is that Chinese geomancy puts even more rules, imposes even more rules on a city where mountains should be, where water should be. But yeah, it's if something can change its purpose, the purpose of those who receive it, and still be called the same. It's the sameness principle, as complicated as this term translation, right?
Yes, certainly. Well, let me see. I think I have another question related to that, actually, in a way that this is something I have discussed many times with Dean Speaks and many other faculty members here, which has to do with, I think you both touch upon this issue, the idea of imagination in both the capital city planning and also the idea of magnitude and multiplicity. And one interesting fact is that I think, Nancy, you also showed us the archival maps of pretty much all the capital cities in the empirical Chinese urban history. And none of those cities were built according to the Wangcheng plan or the very first ideal city plan. So for me, I'm just always very curious about this almost intentional discrepancy between what's being imagined, what's being planned, and what's actually realized and grounded eventually, both spatially and socially. So I wonder, maybe this also ties back to Jianfei's idea of big data, or as a metaphor. I wonder how far can we go with, this. I'm constantly trying to tie it back to, the idea of the concept of superblock. How far can we use that as really an abstraction of, let's say, an urban form in let's say the Chinese context here?
Well, I mean, Montmonier told us that maps lie, right? and Chinese maps lie also. It's a strong word, but it's a fact. Word and image and reality, for a very long time, people who dealt with Chinese urbanism didn't have the physical reality. But the physical reality sometimes does not reflect the picture. And so that's another part of this that's changed how people look at cities that no longer survive and then can be excavated. But to me, the fundamental problem is the age, the longevity of space that we're trying to assign or trying to look at in terms of modern principles. And that's fundamental. I mean, yeah, the fact is this idealized version of Chinese planning is a picture. and a textual description. And only one person implemented, and that was a Chinese official who was advising Kublai Khan. That's now a fact, okay? So.
Yeah, following Nancy's observation, I like to add that my cultural comparison, I deliberately excluded the political issue because there is a political concern. In reality, there's always a culture and politics intertwined, and the intertwining of the two makes the issue interesting and complex. But for my presentation, I focused on culture only, and I was not looking at imperial political control, which is another side of the issue. And if we are facing Chinese heritage, it's a very complex heritage, and it's not about right or wrong. I mean, if you want it to be straightforward, it has good and bad thing, really. It's very difficult, it's complex, and it has many modern consequences, you know. Yeah, but just following Nancy's observation, imperial planning and the Chinese landscape painting, which I cited, are actually for the imperial court, for the emperor. So there is a political dimension to it, and it has been a problem in the 20th century and 21st century. But coming back to the culture issue, what I'm saying is that it's possible to have large-scale composition while having local and microscopic richness, and the two may not be against each other, like Liu Jiakun's work or like Chinese painting. So the big and the small can go with each other. The big is not necessarily a problem if we are looking at from design's point of view. If we just reduce it to a design point of view, you know. So
yes, I'd like to follow up on. I know Lawrence has a very important question lining up here. Just 1 second, Lawrence. I want to follow up with a question that it seems to me that Jennifer, you're arguing for a kind of consistency in understanding the Chinese city. For example, your argument about the magnitude and largeness, that can be also taken into the reading of the contemporary Chinese city, where the block are huge, humongous, right? The super block probably manifests the best in the Chinese contemporary urbanization. Are you basically saying that there is a kind of consistency that can be argued from that cultural perspective lenses?
I'm only saying that in the past, there is a consistency in Chinese pre-modern tradition. There's a consistency. There's a certain tolerance or even expectation of large-scale operation. And for geomancy, for planning, for Chinese painting, for encyclopedia, it's massive. And the massiveness is on the one hand to do with mindset, on the other hand, to do with politics. So it is, as formed over a long time, it is consistent. But today, we got to deal with it. The baggage is complex. And for modern China, it is another complex. It's about communism, socialism. But what about before 1949? China was not communist. It was a Republican China, which is in Taiwan today. So there's a layers of issue here. Taiwan is, also following Chinese culture, just like North Korea and South Korea. So you see my point. That's why I want to separate them. North Korea, South Korea, same culture, different politics. So there's no necessary connection between tradition and present practice. However, there is a relationship. There's a relationship. So yeah, today's socialist China, I think it does rely on certain imperial cultural past for its operation.
Great, thank you for the clarification. It's also very interesting observation and also very interesting tension that you separate this culture and political reading. I think it's something I've never actually taken that way in terms of approaching this topic yet. But I think it's very refreshing to see your perspective. Lawrence, I know you have maybe two questions already put in the chat. Do you want to elaborate yourself? I know one of the question actually is very much related to something I wanted to ask about modernization, modernism. Please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Liang, for convening this symposium. Thank you, Jianfei and Nancy, for those really rich and inspiring presentations. It actually, listening to the three of you, I also have a kind of comment to offer about some of the things that you've brought up. But I'll start with the two questions, and I have a million, but I'll just stick to these two. One, I was really interested in how the two of you might reconcile the kind of clarity and rigidness of a classically derived orthogonal diagram like the Wangchang, with this more easygoing relationship between the medieval city and the countryside, as depicted in paintings like Qingming Shanghetu, along the river during the Qingming festival, in which, like, famously, like, there is like those city walls are actually much less imposing, you know, seen through that perspective of the landscape scroll than they appear in the diagram. And then the other question was, you know, and maybe this is a way of connecting Peter and Eve's presentations to this part of the symposium, was that, you know, it really struck me listening to Nancy and Jianfei's presentations that, you know, the differences between this modern discourse of the superblock and a pre-modern discourse of the ward, you know, is also related to the modern division of labor in the building trades that we see most dramatically in the colonized world, in East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, right? That this is a really nascent profession. And I'm curious how this new profession of the architect in the 19th and 20th centuries might reshape understandings of urban planning and urban space. So some of the examples that Nancy showed, you know, underscored that kind of polysemous character of urban planning in the classical, medieval, and early modern periods in China, that it's not just being done by one person with a specialized, you know, base of knowledge, but is undertaken by many different specialists, including astrologers. And you know, astrology is not part of the curriculum at Syracuse. I don't think it's part of the curriculum at Harvard or at Penn, but, you know, there it was, like, for, you know, millennia, this is part of like the toolkit that one needs to design a city. And then the comment that occurred to me listening to the three of you talk now was, you know, that we're sort of like, we've looked at the grid repeatedly, you know, in this symposium. And I think there's a tendency to understand that grid is an expression of a rational understanding of space, when in fact, the grid has a cosmological history, and historians like Joseph Rickford have pointed out the ways that it's, you know, you can trace it back to the Agrimensaurus and, you know, in Imperial Rome, and how they are surveying the territory of the empire, but using these cosmological foundations to create that grid. So it strikes me that, you know, and maybe this will help reconcile some of the tension that Nancy has brought out between the superblock and the ward, is that something survives. I mean, that seems to be like, you know, like a kind of sub-theme of all of the presentations, that, you know, whether you look at this something that's surviving as baggage or as an aperture into, you know, reappraising our understanding of the modern and what it means to live in the modern world. But that those ideas, those cosmological ideas are still very much a part of the superblock, even though there may not be a clear historical trajectory between the ward and the superblock. That's all. And thank you all. This was great.
Thank you, Lars.
Should I make a comment? I'll go quickly. So I see so much, even of what happens in 20th century China, as being grounded in China's multimillennial past. I can almost always find something. And so this idea of city and country, or palace and garden, there is a tomb from the 2nd century CE at a place called Holingar, just north of the city of Datong. And it has on its walls 6 images of cities where the person who's buried there governed during the course of his rise in officialdom. And then it has his manor. And the cities are drawn with rigid straight lines, probably with a ruler or some kind of measuring stick. And the countryside is drawn with free-flowing lines like a painting. And this is, I think, whether it's intentional or not intentional, they just coexist. The same person governed in the city and lived in the country. And I think I think one can draw a parallel with the city and the garden. One of the things that struck me the first time I was in Suzhou was that I was anticipating going into a garden, but to get there, I went through a gate right on a city street. And I had no idea what was behind that gate. And that was privacy, and that was the world outside the city, inside the city. So, this is coexistence of multiplicity of form and sociological lifestyle. But those wards exist. I don't know where we go from there, but that was my answer to the first thing that you asked. Maybe we'll let Professor Chu answer the second, or you can come back to me and I'll answer it again.
Leon, could I quickly just maybe make one quick observation, because it links Nancy's comment to Professor Chu's presentation, and I would be curious to hear what thoughts you have related to the answer you just gave, Nancy, on Shenzhen, because Shenzhen is an almost entirely new city, made up of super blocks, and yet it has villages, Nantou among them, from more than 1,000 years ago, and it also has urban villages, which are like wards but are very informal. And so, in a city like Shenzhen, I think it's more akin, if you look at it in its totality. And urban villages, while they're informal, between 1/4 and 1/3 of the people in Shenzhen live in these informal developments. And to Lawrence's point, also, they're constructed not by professional architects necessarily. That's why the buildings are called kissing buildings, because they're actually they come too close. They break almost all the codes, and yet so many people live there. And without them, it's hard to imagine Shenzhen even existing, because all of the workers have moved from the countryside and all over China. I'm suggesting is that, like what Qianfei is saying with Chinese, let's say, landscape painting, Songdan is a landscape painting that has both microscopic detail and capacious, wide open spaces, but that's nonetheless planned. You can see the same thing about Shenzhen, one of the most contemporary cities in the world that has, it's not a medieval quarter, but it works like a medieval quarter in urban villages, but it has big, gigantic thoroughfares. It's very top down, and yet it's not. I wonder what you all make of Shenzhen as an example of this carrying over of a sensibility that's pre-modern into a contemporary period.
So to go to Professor Zhu's point, Shenzhen is a city with height. That's one of the most dramatic changes between pre-modern and modern China. Land ownership is a sign of wealth. City space builds out because it shows how much money someone has. Building up already breaks down pre-modern conceptions, even if someone has a courtyard in between 4 30-story or 50-story buildings. So I think it's a very difficult example. It's as hard to use as Hong Kong to me for that reason. That's why I mentioned the Chinese division of their own contemporary history as contemporary and very contemporary and just yesterday. That's this Dang Dang Dai that I just mentioned. I think Shenzhen is sort of 1980 on. I mean, yeah, of course it existed like Hong Kong existed, but to me, it's a very different concept. The same challenge that I had when trying to justify the use of the term city block in pre-modern China.
Yeah, let me clarify what I was suggesting. What I was suggesting is not that Shenzhen and its contemporary development is, dates back to to Qing Shi Huang or to the Han Dynasty or to whatever, but it's obviously a very contemporary city. What I'm suggesting is its makeup, its morphology, sociologically, and its component pieces are as differentiated as the kind of city that, for example, Peter was talking about earlier, and that Zhenfei is suggesting in terms of scale in a Chinese landscape painting. Yes, of course, everything in Shenzhen really came up in 1980. It's just that about 100 different morphologies emerged all at once from 1980 to now, including super tall, including super small, including gigantic boulevards, including almost everything. You throw the kitchen sink in and it's in Shenzhen. Yeah, so sorry, Zhenfei, did you have a, anyway, Nancy, thank you. I just wanted to clarify what I was observing.
If I can follow Lawrence Charles' observation about ward and strict urban planning, and also following Nancy's study, I'd like to add that the ward, which was enclosed, was gradually actually relaxed in later part from the Song Dynasty on. Anyway, in case of Beijing, it's no longer physical. There's a wall administratively, but not physically. There's no wall within the block in Beijing in the Qing Dynasty. Now, the other thing is about geometry. The geometry is much clearer and stronger in northern China, whereas in southern China, perhaps because of topography and for various other factors, like Nanjing, Hangzhou, it's more relaxed. So it's not strict. And again, Nancy showed lots of examples where the Chinese urban planning is not geometrically strict. It's actually quite irregular. So it's adapting to different contexts in different places, especially in southern China. It's not strict. It's not geometrically so strict, partly because of topography.
Actually, there is. I don't know if before actually we do have a question from one of the audiences here, but before we go there, I wonder if Eve and Peter has any responses to that or observations.
Yeah, there's tons of things. I thank you both. The one thing can you speak of geometry before the 16th century, which is when I understand Euclid was brought into China by the Jesuits, i.e. the kind of order that from the air that looks like geometry is actually being built up out of ritual, out of construction practices. It's a kind of different metabolism, and to describe it as geometry is to kind of sell it short in terms of what's actually happening. Would you agree with that?
Well, I would say you're dealing with measured space and people are measuring. So the complexity of Euclid's geometry was not being practiced. Mathematicians weren't using it, but mathematicians were measuring, and they were measuring the angle at which the sun falls to set the calendar. All kinds of things are being measured with measuring devices.
I think that's very good. And I think what I'm trying to suggest is that this business of looking for an imaginary, I'm probably on your side in this question of, can we use the term superblock? That superblock comes out of spatial thinking rather than out of the concrete practices. And I think what you say about cities and control, I don't know of a period when democracy flourished in China. There is a consistent fear of the populace that, of course, the 8th century rebellions and so on and so forth. But I am intrigued by all the stuff that goes around things like the Liu Bo board and Mingtang and all of this sort of stuff, that it's not geometrical, it's symbolic, it's practices, it's visual configurations. It's a much more concrete, one has to put a whole different world together, and geometry flattens it.
But it's also modular.
Yes. I would agree with that.
So maybe that's China's way out, understanding, expression of how to build symmetrically and with measuring. There's a module behind the construction of the Mingtang or anything else.
I think what you say about measure is very important, because that's, of course, the principal metaphor in notions of justice.
That's interesting.
But particularly
That's very interesting.
I mean, I think you're onto something with measure. I think that's,
Maybe.
and I'm intrigued by this infinity of detail, because it's the continuity between one and the other that's the issue.
Mhm.
That John Fay was talking about.
Mhm.
But the funny, the Chinese historical movies always show the wards like European medieval cities, people dressed in burlap and fighting each other. And there's absolutely no sense of a ward in any of the movies I've watched. I don't know quite where that comes from. It's like a movie convention.
Interesting. Actually, we do have one question that is directly related to I think Jinfei and Nancy and Peter's comments about control and wards. It's from Benjamin John, and he's asking, I'm interested in Dr. Steinhardt's use of control as sort of disqualifier of wards to be considered as super blocks. Circling back to the Hudson Yard project, the degree of control is one of the most remarkable things about that super block developments. It is simply controlled by capital versus controlled by political authorities. Thoughts on that, I guess?
Well, I mean, I'm going to agree that anything large scale is going to involve money and is going to involve politics. Would I substitute capitalism for control by the emperor? I think I'd like to hear what other speakers have to say about that. Is the concept of super block really intended to give opportunity to the population? If it is, this is fundamentally not a pre-modern Chinese urban concept. I guess I stand by that. I don't really want to get political on the screen, but I guess it's fair to say that equal opportunity is not a fundamental concept of the ward system of Chang'an, and the breakdown in Song doesn't mean that the population had more control, even though I guess people, person by person, might have been wealthier, but I'm not sure about that either.
I would say, though, interestingly, about the super block as a modern urban form or urban formation or process or system, that it's very much tied to industrial production, actually, and industrial culture. And so it embodies those contradictions, that it is actually about control, but it allows for certain freedoms. I mean, it's one of those contradictions of modern capitalism, I guess. And that, but it is, the whole production of the urban fabric within the context of superblock is about an industrialized process of production, of design and production, actually.
Actually, I'm curious because I was going to ask you, Eve, to respond to that question. I'm glad you did, and I'm wondering if you could maybe more specifically speak to this. Of course, in your scholarship, with regard to the socialist context in terms of the planning and also the superblock development there in that territory. How do you see that idea of a control being played in there, and how does that actually relate to, let's say, the very beginning and the first implementation of the superblock idea, where it is actually not about control, it's about the as you framed solar equity. How does that transition and transformation happen?
Well, I think that the idea and Unwin's idea was that, I mean, he had a very particular thing that he wanted to do with the superblock, right? Which was this concern for solar equity, and that the superblock would allow him to disengage the building from the building line, right? And so you could do things in the city, you could organize space within the superblock that wasn't actually controlled in the same way by, the capitalist system of urban development. And so that was his idea. And that idea kind of, what I found interesting was to trace that through and how it ended up in socialist space. And then the method of production, however, is something that came later. And it's I mean, there is a thread that goes through it that is very interesting. But at the same time, that the solar equity and the notions of equity altogether can disappear very easily from that. And in fact, what happened, in the later socialist period, where for economic reasons, but also in terms of values, that a lot of the social infrastructure just didn't get built. So it was crane urbanism, actually. It was purely industrial production. And now it's getting back its kind of social qualities in certain contexts. But so, these things aren't, and there were, superblock itself. I mean, this is one concept of superblock. And I was trying to make that sort of clear rather than saying superblock follows this trajectory, because there are many others. This is just one.
Yes, it's interesting that you describe the crane urbanism. It's a weird, it's like a Marxist response to Fordism. And you end up with kind of mass construction or, industrial production of, that's the kind of ethos. And there's a lot of propaganda that goes behind it. It's a political instrument of its own.
Yes.
Both working for it and enjoying its benefits and so forth.
Yes. Absolutely. It's tied to Fordism. It's industrial production. And for, mass production, mass consumption.
Yes, it's interesting, this business of, all of European history. It's from Cordoba to Chang'an. It's kings or queens and their courts, for at least until the 14th century. And so it's not like, but the nature of what is the body politic, what does constitute a common symbolic structure, what is coercive? As is usually said in moments like this, what's preserved is the work of the elite and the people who are literate and who have the money and so on and so forth. And I don't know, you look at something like the 1001 Nights, and it's kind of embarrassing. It's all sort of silly, but it's very much set away from the court. It's set in, rather naive dreams of beautiful women and lots of jewels and, lots of food. And some of the Chinese literature that it explores, people who live on the margins are really quite interesting in terms of how they move back and forth, how they're anxious about being decorous. And of course, when you get to something like the Book of Rights, you've got a machine by which 1 million people do fall into order
Mhm,
on the basis of belief
mhm.
and anxiety. I mean, you can get it wrong with a cuff, with a embroidery on your cuff. And so that it's not entirely top down, but it's definitely not, the messy democracy or the kind of messy world that I'm talking about with
Yeah.
large block urbanism.
No, and the only way to get any angle on the populace in pre-industrial times, and I think which is shared with Western Europe and China, is the monastery. There are some, we know that some people got educated, some people who were of no means lived in monasteries, got educated in monasteries, but they don't actually go out then and live in the city anyway. But the very similar kind of records there. Yeah, we have, for reason you mentioned, there's almost nothing known about the 99% of China's population that's assumed to have been illiterate before the year, I don't know, 1800, 1850, I don't know when literacy boomed for the year 1750, 1800, I don't know.
Well, the usual standard in Europe for people getting along is the Muslim occupation of Spain,
Oh, that's different, yeah.
where the three Adamic religions got along with each other and contributed to each other's understanding and so forth until Isabella came on the throne. And anyway, let's not go there.
All right. Thank you, Peter and Nancy. I was just informed that I think we probably will need to wrap up because we're already running over time from our schedule. And Michael and I would like to, before we conclude our session and event today, we would like to ask each of you to reflect on our conversation, though I hope it was longer, but your reflection and thoughts on the some of the threads and concept that we have discussed today. And selfishly, I do have one personal question for each of you, and hopefully you can, I want to hear, maybe I just need some kind of confirmations from your thoughts. And this is something I have been discussing many times for a long time with Dean Speaks, about this idea of modernism and the process of modernization. And I know this is a huge topic and probably it itself warrants another big conference and discussion. But I'm relating back to all the ideas, especially centered around this topic of superblock, it becomes more clear to me after today's conversation that it's really hard and it's almost impossible to argue for, let's say, a singular reading of this superblock development from the West to the East Europe and to China. And it even seems to me now, like from Nancy's presentation, that it's equally hard and difficult to make that argument even within the Chinese context. So I wonder what's maybe what's your take on that, the superblock discourse in relation with a larger set of modernism narrative and modernization process in a larger and broader picture. And it would be great if you can reflect on any of those concepts and threads we talked in the event today. So.
I'll start, I guess.
Okay.
I just saying,
Okay.
I learned a tremendous amount from today's conference, and I'm very grateful for that. And I realized that, and I think that one of the points that really has been made today is the importance of specificity in our research, historical specificity in particular, and that concepts like superblock, I'm beginning to sort of, even question the use of the term at the moment. and to be more specific in the way, in particular, in the way in which I use it and think about it. And so I think that, this has been tremendously interesting because, looking at the Chinese city, one looks at it, through a certain, Western modern lens, and you see super blocks, you see large blocks, but they don't mean the same thing. And so, once again, it's what you see is not what's there, and what something looks like is not what it means. And so that is the lesson of, this is what history is all about, and research.
So I had written down right before Eve began, we do this because we learned so much. And we all learned so much today. I think that a word like modernism or modernization, wherever in the world it happens, if it's a literate society, is going to require certain stages. There are people who've written about this. I don't know who to quote right now. But I think if we want to talk about something happening in a modern society, to answer your question, Leon, there are going to be certain social occurrences that have to happen and political occurrences for that to take place. But the final comment that I might make, again, going back to China, is that Professor Zhu's comments about size and scale can't be taken lightly. China is an enormous country and in fact is the hub for East Asia. And the cities that we deal with, that's why I showed a couple pictures from Japan and from Mongolia, and I didn't put Korea in. Anything that one sees in China is going to move and change and probably be imitated through, even in certain modern circumstances, outside China. And for China, what becomes very interesting when we talk about modernization is the Russian model, which uses, if there's a connection in modern times in this ideology of a super bloc, it's coming from Russia to China as powerfully as it might be coming directly from Western Europe.
Yeah, that's it. I would like to echo all the thanks for the opportunity to learn things. And I think what Michael said about Shenzhen is an important moment. What it raises is that however you define superblock, you need to set it in a wider scheme of differentiation of how you're understanding how the urban order is structured or structures itself. I'm aware that the China Bay project, which the party sees as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, is intending to make everything from Macau up to Guangzhou into a version of Shenzhen. When you get into that topography, which of course is vast, Michael's right. There's about 20 different kinds of urbanism in there, ranging from little tiny villages that have gotten swallowed up to a cricket ground that's now the piazza in a very bleak housing project. And the factory topographies are really adaptable and interesting and are adapting. And they're happening in different times and different forms of commitment. You just can't, if it's about control, it doesn't look like, Han Chang'an. It's a, and I think that is probably, in terms of a future and how to, develop an imaginary, I think that the Shenzhen or that delta topography has enough examples for you to set superblock in with those options and those potentials, and which are dying and reviving and which might be more creative. And of course, you're going to have to decide on how much control you think is a good thing. But, thanks very, very much. I'm really grateful to have been invited.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay, if I can say a few words. One thing we kind of touched upon, but we have not really raised as an issue, and that is the geography and the landmass and the scale of continental landmass. And I have a statement in my mind all the time. It may not be correct, but I like to share with you that in my observation, and China, if you compare to Europe, Europe had city-state, and China had state, really. China has empire and the state. In a more strict sense of the word, state. China has the state, whereas Europe has the city or the city-state. So there's an issue about politics and scale. That's one thing that I like to observe. The other, I mean, coming back to Leon's concern about modernity and modernization and the problem of superblock. I think in my learning today, I think the idea and the problem of superblock is very much a modern phenomenon because of industrialization. And partly is also to do with the rise of socialist state in Eastern Europe and Soviet Union and China. So the superblock that you talk about specifically, is a modern problem, a modern phenomenon, and is to do with industrialization, mass production, and the power of the state in Europe, Eastern Europe, and Russia and China. So it is a very specific modern problem that is to do with production, the scale of production. But in the case of China or Asia, then, and Europe as well, culture always also come in, cultural tradition also come in, but it comes in a very peculiar way. So it's very complicated. The cultural tradition comes into the picture in a very uncertain and in a very indirect way. That's why I compare North Korea versus South Korea. Same tradition, but you have completely different system. So in North Korea, you have culture merge into communism, and in South Korea, you have South Korean culture merge into a capitalist system, and they're both having relation with tradition. But the relation is not direct. It's not necessary. It's not a causal relationship. So if we study it as a historical phenomenon, but if we look at it as a design problem, then we need to bring all resource possible to deal with the problem. If we are seeing it as a design problem, as an architect or as an urban planner, then probably we should pick up whatever we think is performing or is delivering. Then we can bring them in, including Chinese culture or any other culture. But culture is very distant and very to do with mind and thinking, and politics is something more reasoned and more specific. And we need to separate them, but we also need to connect them. So that's my my statement. Yeah. Thank you for inviting me and inviting for this great symposium. And I learned a lot from all of you. Yeah.
Thank you, Jianfei. Thank you for all your statements and observations from our discussion today. And I just want to say personally, I've learned enormously from all of you, from your presentation, all your remarks and discussions and distillation of ideas. You know, I think that all your insights really have provide a lot of clarities for the questions I had in mind before this event and also along my research. And also to some extent, the hypothesis that I put forth at the very beginning of the discussion. But at the same time, it posed new questions for me that I think needs a little bit more efforts and time to figure it out in my future research and teaching. And I think it's probably the same to all of us to further contemplate a lot of the questions that posed in today's discussion. And I just want to thank you for your important contribution and participation in this event. Thank you very much. And also, I'd like to thank all of our audiences for spending this busy afternoon with us. And thank you very much. Michael, do you have any last remarks to add?
No, I would just like to again join you in thanking everyone. Thank you, Evie, for setting us up and for helping organize, and for all of our team. Thank you all for joining us here at Syracuse University for this 5th Boghossian Fellow Symposium. Stay tuned, there'll be more, and I hope we'll be able to do something exciting with this material. And Liang will be continuing to do some work with us, and very likely we'll do an exhibition in the fall. So thank you all, and congratulations, Liang. You've done a great job.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you to all of you. Stay well and have a good day.
Yes.
Buonanotte.
Yes.
Bye bye. Take care.